This is Judy Woodruff in California. You are looking at the El Toro Marine Air Base here in California, where an Air Force plane is just landing with the coffin of former President Richard Milhous Nixon on board, along with members of the Nixon family and close friends. CNN will be bringing you live coverage of the ceremony there at the airport and here in Yorba Linda, where I am, several miles away from El Toro. A few hours ago, the president's coffin was put aboard that plane in New York. As we said, Mr. Nixon's 2 daughters, their husbands, and President Nixon's 4 grandchildren boarded the plane after the ceremony at Stewart Air National Guard Base. That was the scene at Stewart Air National Guard Base near Newburgh, New York, just a few hours ago. I'm here now at the Nixon birthplace and library in Yorba Linda, California, the final destination for the Nixon motorcade that will arrive here this afternoon. As you can hear from the noise around me, there is construction still underway, preparing for tomorrow's memorial service. We had a strong, heavy downpour of rain this morning. Right now, the sun is shining, but there's a stiff breeze in the area, and there are still clouds in the distance, so a lot of people are holding their breaths, hoping the weather stays clear. First, as we have reported, the jet that was Air Force One during the Nixon presidency will touch down at the Marine Air Station in El Toro, California. CNN's Bruce Morton is there now. He joins us with the latest. Bruce.
Judy, we're, like you, praying for good weather here. We just put our umbrellas down about 5 minutes ago, but the sun is shining now. And as you can see, the plane that was Air Force One during the Nixon presidency has landed. It's taxiing its way over here. The honor guard is in place, the cortege is in place, the motorcade, which will be driving the 30 or so miles from here at El Toro Marine Air Center over to Yorba Linda, where you are. The plane is just landed a little bit ago and is still taxiing. These things always take a certain amount of time. In the meantime, troops are in place. The honor guard from the various ceremonial units are here from Washington, D.C., the Marines from Marine headquarters in Washington, the Army, the 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard from Fort Myers in Virginia. The band is local. It is the El Toro Marine Band. And there are a few other people here, no public. There's really nobody been admitted to the base today except a few friends of people who are normally stationed here. So this is a crowd essentially of press and military. The big public gathering, of course, will come later at the library. Now the plane is turning finally, moving a little more towards us. You can also see out there another contingent of Marines with the howitzers, which will be firing the ceremonial salute. All of this just saying goodbye to a man who knew this Marine base well. He returned here often. He returned here, of course, as an ex-president, perhaps his most dramatic flight. And this, of course, the last trip, the final one.
Bruce, do we know at this point who among family and friends, rather, is on board that plane with the president's body?
We don't know about friends, Judy. We do know about family. The 2 daughters, of course, Julie Nixon Eisenhower, her husband David, and their 3 children. Teresa Nixon Cox, her husband Ed, and their son Christopher. But we'll kind of have to wait and see for the rest. Those are the only names that, that the military have given out here.
It is very much the case, Bruce, as I know you know, that the Nixon family has taken charge of all the arrangements surrounding this memorial and funeral service. They decided they did not want any of the ceremony to take place in the nation's capital in Washington. They wanted everything at former President Nixon's request to be in California and truly on his home turf, and that's where we are right now.
Well, I suspect, Judy, that they were simply carrying out his wishes. I think Mr. Nixon had a lot to do with all this. He's the kind of man who would have anticipated his death, anticipated his funeral, and planned for it, being a planning kind of man. You know, all during his kind of rehabilitation phase after he resigned the presidency, he was visible, he'd do foreign trips, he'd do things like that, but he avoided big Washington events. He never, for instance, went to a Republican National Convention. And I think that that kind of feeling may have led to this scenario. And now, here is the plane, as you can hear, getting closer and closer.
For all the years that he dominated political life in this country, indeed, as you were just suggesting, he only actually lived and served in government in Washington. I counted the years up the other a little while ago, was 18 years. And this is for someone who first came to Washington as a member of Congress in 1946, came representing the district around Whittier, California, which is not too far from where I am in Yorba Linda.
Judy, the plane is just rolling to a halt here. The family and friends will be coming out the front door up by the nose there. The casket will be coming out the back of the plane. And for those of you who have watched presidential arrivals and departures over the years, the tail number will be familiar, 27000. That is the old Air Force One, which took many presidents all over the world.
This has to be a very, very, obviously it's a sad time, a very melancholy time for the Nixon family. They lost, for the daughters, Julie Nixon Eisenhower and Patricia Nixon Cox, they lost their mother in June of last year. She is buried here at the library where President Nixon will be buried tomorrow. So it's been a very difficult year for all of them.
I think maybe especially for him, I'm not an old Nixon friend, but I know some people who are, who said that his wife's death really diminished him. You know, that he seemed to lose some of the taste for living that he'd had before. Now you can see the nose door opening there.
Mm-hmm. These are some scenes, Bruce, here at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, where you can see dozens and perhaps hundreds of people. I can't get a good shot by the eye from here, but it looks as if perhaps hundreds of people are already gathered, waiting to catch a glimpse of the funeral motorcade when it arrives a little more than an hour from now. And now back to El Toro Marine Base, where you are.
Right, both doors on this 707 open now. The family, we've been told, will be coming out the front, as I said, and Mr. Nixon's casket out the rear, where you see that platform and the bearer is ready to receive it.
Bruce, there is a great deal of protocol involved with these ceremonies, is there not?
Well, there's a whole little branch of government whose rules I've been relearning this morning called the Military District of Washington, and they are in charge of events like this. Even though this event is in California, they're in charge of it. And they've done it before. They have a protocol, and they follow it quite strictly.
We know that there will be we're broadening out now the picture to see more of the honor guard who are walking toward the plane. But we know there will be a salute. I believe it's a 21-gun salute. It may be more than that. Coming up
21-gun salute, I think. And the band will play America the Beautiful once the salute ends.
I think it's fair to say that President Nixon had a very mixed relationship with this state that he's returning to. This is the state of his birth. It is the state where he was raised, and it is the state that he returned to after he had to resign the presidency in disgrace. But he left California in 1979 to return to the East Coast, and he has not lived here since that time.
No, you know, practiced politics in Washington, practiced law in New York. He always said New York was the fast track if you were a lawyer, and ended his life in the East. I think he had mixed feelings about California for most of his life, one way and another.
And yet on both sides of his family, they were strong pioneering stock. On his mother's side, they were Quakers who came to California in the late 19th century. On his father's side, they came in the early 20th century, Scotch-Irish Methodist background. So there was a mixture of those heritages in his background. As you're seeing the picture here on the right is the flag flying at half-staff here at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, which is, I would guess, Bruce, about, what, 30, 40 miles or so from where you are at the El Toro base.
30 miles is what they've been saying, and they expect the motorcade to go at 30 or 35 miles an hour, and so take an hour, more or less, to get there. That's they turned off the engines finally of this former Air Force One.
Bruce, I know that you know this, and you may have already said it, but they only actually call it Air Force One when the president himself, excuse the hammering in the background, they're constructing a platform where I am near the library, but we know that they only call it Air Force One when the president, the current president, is actually riding on it. And as you said, the name of this plane is 27,000.
Well, that's true, of course, but this was Air Force One for a number of presidents. In fact, until the current 747, which they've only had for a few years.
We're going to have to continue to build this. I know you guys are on the air, so we just got to work. Okay?
And you can see the flag-draped casket now at the rear door.
Bruce, I have been inside some of the planes that have been called Air Force One. I know there have been several of them, and I assume they've had to reconfigure the interior of that plane in order to make space for the president's coffin.
Oh, I assume so. They're all done so that you can rejigger the furniture. Everything slides in and out. You can put beds in for long trips, all that kind of thing.
See this,
and
Bruce,
there's the family. Now you can see the family, the Eisenhowers and the Coxes, walking towards the motorcade, while the honor guard with the casket waits by the rear door of the plane. There had been some talk about friends. I may have missed somebody. What I'm seeing is simply the family, the daughters, the husbands, and the children. And now the casket begins to move. Being lowered first, that's a hydraulic lift, and it has to get down to ground level. That, of course, is Hail to the Chief, the song they play for presidents. Yes.
Claire, you want me to bring this up?
Where you going? Okay, where you going? Do you need me to stay on? Because I can give you the phone. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I just give this phone. Thanks.
And that is really the end of this short ceremony. It's been just about 30 minutes since the plane first landed. The motorcade now leaving El Toro Marine Air Station on its way to the Nixon birthplace and library at Yorba Linda. Judy?
Bruce, as you were saying a little while ago, this is about a 30-mile, about a 45-minute drive. You said they're going to stay at about, what, 30 miles an hour?
That's what
as
they've
they
been telling
drive?
us, yeah.
Do we know if this is the end? Again, I want to apologize for the noise in the background. There's still construction that is very much underway here at the library and birthplace site where tomorrow's funeral will be, and in fact where the motorcade will be in about 45 minutes. But do you know if this is the end of the military's role in this ceremony, or will they continue?
Well, it's the end of the formal military role. I suppose there will be an honor guard, you know, while the late president is lying in state, but this is really the last military gesture, the 21-gun salute, the honor guard, and all that. That's the official ceremonial part of the military's role in this, and that's over.
We know that, and you really suggested this a moment ago, this was a president who paid very great attention to detail, and we know that he no doubt left very specific instructions about what he wanted done after his death. Not only the funeral service tomorrow, but no doubt the preliminary ceremonies today and tomorrow. As we await the Nixon funeral motorcade here, and again, the noise is, I'm competing with a lot of noise here because workmen are still building constructing the platform that the news media will use, and there's another platform nearby where dignitaries will be sitting and others. And let me just go ahead and tell you that this area right behind me, it looks like a parking lot now with a lot of trucks sitting in it. But by tomorrow, we're told there will be chairs for dignitaries. We're told that 55 countries are sending representatives to this ceremony. That's all from here in Yorba Linda at the Nixon birthplace Library and the site of tomorrow's funeral. We'll be back with more coverage of the president's last visit home to California after this.
On Friday. The funeral is begin in several hours from now. Our Judy Woodruff is at the Nixon birthplace in Yorba Linda, California, for more on today's ceremonies.
About 1 hour ago, public viewing of President Nixon's casket ended. Thousands of people had filed past the coffin since late yesterday. Many of them braved yesterday's violent wet weather or the chilly, damp conditions overnight. Inside the library, people saw President Nixon's coffin draped in the stars and stripes and banked by dozens of floral arrangements. President Clinton arrives here in a few hours, as do the 4 living ex-U.S. presidents. We will be covering today's funeral and the events leading up to it live throughout this afternoon and evening. Among other public figures, former Nixon Vice President Spiro Agnew will attend. Agnew, you'll remember, was forced to resign in 1973 after pleading no contest to income tax evasion. From China to Russia to the Middle East, Richard Nixon leaves behind him a legacy of dramatic initiatives in international diplomacy. That legacy includes his handling of the Vietnam War as one of 3 American presidents who had to make decisions about that highly controversial conflict. It was a war that left scars on the United States and on Southeast Asia for decades to follow. CNN World Affairs correspondent Ralph Begleiter.
The People's Republic of China has extended an invitation to President Nixon.
The high points of Richard Nixon's diplomacy are history, his dramatic opening to China in 1972, his new relationship with the Kremlin and the signing of major nuclear arms control agreements with the Soviets, his disengagement of the Arabs and Israelis after their 1973 war, his ending of the Vietnam War and the return of U.S. prisoners. Richard Nixon's presidency is remembered for its breakthroughs in international affairs, but also for the flaws in his realpolitik approach to the world in tandem with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
To be satisfied with the end of communism, or the defeat of communism even, but remembering that our legacy must be making the world safe for freedoms. That is what I have always practiced or worked for during my life.
The sharpest contrast in Mr. Nixon's conduct of international affairs came in his handling of the Vietnam War. The war was raging when Richard Nixon took office. Although he is remembered for ending the war, it was Mr. Nixon who widened it, sending U.S. combat troops into Cambodia for the first time in 1970, fueling an already inflamed anti-war movement at home. 4 U.S. students were killed at Kent State University one day after Mr. Nixon's announcement on Cambodia. It was later revealed Mr. Nixon had authorized secret aerial bombing of Cambodia. Mr. Nixon's actions provoked massive demonstrations in Washington. Mr. Nixon ordered the Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor in 1972, halting it abruptly to send Kissinger to Paris, where, after years of negotiations, a ceasefire was signed within 1 month. Mr. Nixon's Vietnam policy, following on Lyndon Johnson's, alienated a generation and for 20 years limited American presidents' use of military power. Many say Mr. Nixon's handling of Cambodia also led to the overthrow of Prince Sihanouk and set the stage for the killing field years of the Khmer Rouge regime.
One of our great goals during the time that we were waging the war in Vietnam and in Cambodia was to keep the Khmer Rouge from coming to power. They did come to power, and it was a terrible slaughter that they imposed upon the people there. Over 1 million, perhaps as many as 2 million people slaughtered.
It wasn't long before the Nixon-Kissinger team was called into action again to defuse the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. The disengagement agreement Kissinger negotiated with Syria endured without violation through 2 decades of continuing confrontation. Mr. Nixon is credited with persuading Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat to give up Egypt's ties with the Soviet Union, a development which ultimately led to Sadat's historic visit to Israel. Seeing Richard Nixon shake hands with Communist China's Mao Zedong after decades of hostility negated everything most people thought they knew about Mr. Nixon and opened doors to China's massive marketplace. His approach to Moscow opened doors for the West in arms control. His famed debate with Nikita Khrushchev on the set of a showcase kitchen in 1959 left Mr. Nixon uncertain about Russia's future.
He said to me, jabbing his finger into my chest, "Your grandchildren will live under communism." And I responded, "Your grandchildren will live in freedom." At that time, I was sure he was wrong, but I must admit I wasn't sure I was right.
For a man whose political career was made on fanatic anti-communism, Mr. Nixon's dramatic approaches to communist China and the Soviet Union have become legendary strokes of diplomacy. After leaving office, Mr. Nixon continued to use his international reputation as one of his comeback tools, visiting Russia and China in the last 2 years of his life.
But to paraphrase MacArthur, old politicians sometimes die, but they seldom fade away.
Ralph Begleiter, CNN, Washington.
We'll be back here in about 1 hour with live coverage of this evening's services.
As I mentioned, CNN's live coverage of services and eulogies for the 37th president will begin at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's 0000 Greenwich Mean Time. And a CNN special presentation, Richard Nixon Remembered, can be seen at 10 o'clock Eastern Time this evening. That's 0300 Greenwich Mean Time. That's all the time we have for this.
Tried to avoid the draft. You couldn't have imagined two more different people. And yet.
And yet.
You know.
And not only that, his wife, very active First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, worked on the House Impeachment Committee. These are two people, we're starting to look at some of the faces in the crowd here at the library. Red Skelton on the far, I believe on the far right. I think we may have we kept moving out of the picture. When the picture's moving, I should say, he was in there. We're going to see some faces that are familiar to all of us. Ken Kachigian, in fact, who we were just talking to just a moment ago, is one of the people sitting there. It's going to be quite an eclectic crowd. Democrats, Republicans, longtime friends, short-time friends of Richard Nixon among them.
And Bill Clinton, who by the end of his life, the end of Mr. Nixon's life, had so far come around that as president, Clinton was listening to Nixon, was taking counsel from him, made a moving little statement at the beginning of his press conference the other day about, I'm grateful for his advice on Russia, on China, and other areas. And I think it genuinely come to think this guy whose war I so hated knows something about all this foreign stuff, which I really don't know that much about.
That's right. I know a number of people were struck by the warmth of President Clinton's statement on Friday night. He was the one who came out and officially announced the death of the late President Nixon. And he said, he commented that he was a great statesman. He said he lived in controversial times, but he made many contributions. And it was a much warmer statement than one thinks we might have heard from this president or perhaps any intervening president if Richard Nixon had died 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, we all could sit around and speculate all day long about that. But I think it's fair to say that if this had happened some years ago, the reaction might be very different.
Well, the nickname President Clinton used for himself during the last presidential campaign was the comeback kid. Well, if you want a comeback kid, of course, his name is Richard Nixon. And I think that's one thing they had in common. They're very different kinds of politicians. Richard Nixon didn't like the hands-on, flesh-pressing, all of that sort of personal stuff, working the crowd, and Clinton loves it. But the one thing they have in common is you hit them and they come back.
And another thing you'd have to say that they don't have in common is one is a great love of international affairs, whereas on the other hand, Bill Clinton, you might say, keeps arm's length. I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. He doesn't probably stay up late at night being fascinated by international affairs, although he certainly had his share of international problems to land in his lap since he came to the presidency, 15, 16 months ago.
I suppose you could argue they'd have been terrific co-presidents, Bill, you look after the domestic stuff. I'll
right.
worry about China
That's
or
right.
Bosnia or whatever it is this week.
That's right. This is very much a president whose plane is taxiing now on Air Force One, who is fascinated with domestic policy. And as I was just saying, Ken Kachigian was just saying to me that was not an area that Richard Nixon was his favorite, although he made some great contributions in that area. He was first president. He established the Environmental Protection Agency and other moves. Joining us now from the studio back in Washington, CNN studio in Washington, is Michael Beschloss, presidential historian. Michael, what else do you comes to mind when you contrast the presidencies of these two men?
Well, I think your point is very apt about the fact that Richard Nixon was very much engaged on the foreign side and Bill Clinton elected as a domestic president. I think one thing that really ties the two men together, and I think maybe was a very strong strain, or at least a strong bond between them during the last 16 months, was the fact that Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon are two of the domestic political masters of the last 30 or 40 years. Richard Nixon was known while president and even before then for knowing which ward captain in Ohio to call up to put the arm on a congressman to get some help either in an election campaign or in getting a bill passed. That's exactly the same kind of thing that Bill Clinton has been known for doing. Since they came from two different sides of the aisle, it's very unlikely that they had that kind of a conversation. And the irony is that it's foreign affairs that was the main subject between them over the last year and a half.
It is. There are so many ironies there. Richard Nixon, you've been listening perhaps to some of this conversation, Michael.
Yes.
Was a man of just enormous contradiction, and it's almost become a cliche in the last few days to talk about that. But why is it that, in your view, why is it that someone who could on the one hand be so shy, on the other hand so aggressive politically, on the one hand who could be so ruthless with his enemies and so gentle with his friends, how is it that someone like that could be as successful as he was politically?
I think part of it was sheer will. Nixon used to always say that he was an introvert in an extrovert's profession. This was someone who was tremendously self-disciplined and in a way felt more comfortable when he was in a situation that ran against his grain than when he was relaxing. You know, Judy, in 1979, when Nelson Rockefeller died, Richard Nixon, when he paid tribute to Rockefeller, who was really one of his own old adversaries in the Republican Party, said the thing that he admired about Rockefeller was that Rockefeller could have sat on the beach and relaxed all of his life. He had the money to do so, but in fact, he subjected himself to political struggle. Nixon felt the same way. He often said, after he lost for governor in 1962 and after leaving the White House in '74, that unless he was involved in some kind of battle, he would be mentally dead in 6 months and physically dead in 12.
I think that's one of the differences is that you said, Michael, that they were both gifted politicians, and that's true, but they were gifted in very different ways. Nixon was a good political strategist. He could foresee developments. I remember when he was running against George Wallace in 1968, talking to us and saying, oh, he's going to fade, he's going to fade, he's going to fade. But he wasn't a good instinctual politician. He didn't say the funny right thing to the crowd. Clinton, on the other hand, loves the in-person dealing, loves working the room, loves picking up the baby along the parade route. He's just a natural for all that, and it made Richard Nixon squirm.
Why could he be successful when it repelled him to do some of those things that you described?
Well, he was one of the people who helped change American politics. You can argue that he lost in 1960 to John Kennedy over television, but he was the first generation of television politicians. And of course, the in-person stuff mattered less. He wanted a nice picture for the evening news, but the fact is that the campaigns were communicating more and more in 30-second spots and on the evening news, and the in-person stuff mattered less. He never was happy working the room. He just, wasn't. He did it, kind of the way, a kid who hated arithmetic would show up for class every morning, but he didn't love it, and Clinton does.
In fact,
go ahead.
One thing I wanted to just come in on what Bruce said, which I agree with entirely, is that Richard Nixon learned from his mistakes. When Jimmy Carter was president for about a year and a half, a friend asked Nixon how he thought Carter was going to do, Nixon said he didn't think that Carter would win re-election because Carter did not learn from his mistakes. Nixon was he felt victimized by television in 1960, but by 1968, he got very good help to script him, teach him how to deal with the tube, and also make sure that Nixon appeared on television, as both of you will remember, only in very controlled atmospheres that were intended to show him to best advantage. That's a very common thing now, less so in 1968.
It kind of invented the controlled photo op, I think, and those town meetings that we know more recently as Ask George Bush, he started those controlled audience, controlled questions.
We've been looking at pictures of Air Force One, which is, you can see, parked at the El Toro Marine Air Station in California, 20-some miles from Yorba Linda, where Bruce and I are. CNN's Bob Vito is there at El Toro. Bob, who can you tell us is on hand to greet President Clinton?
Good afternoon, Judy. It's really exciting in some ways to see all of these people back together again. Among those on board Air Force One invited by President Clinton to travel along with him, former Secretary of State William Rogers, former Attorney General Elliot Richardson, and former White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig. Of course, along with Mr. Clinton, traveling with him, Governor George McGovern, who ran against Mr. Nixon in 1972. It's almost, in a sense, gives you a real sense of history to see all these people together, and is reminiscent of back in 1972 when I covered the inauguration, actually 1973, covered the inauguration, and it brings back many memories to me of what a time it was, and what a time it was indeed. Judy?
All right, Bob Vito, thank you. We can see that the crowd there at El Toro is still waiting for President Clinton and some of the others to come down. We have, as we were mentioning, 2,500 some people who are invited guests, the funeral services here at Yorba Linda. There is a huge contingent, I should say a large contingent of foreign dignitaries, many of them ambassadors in the area behind where Bruce and I are sitting. We're still looking at the door of Air Force One waiting for President Clinton to emerge. There is a large delegation from the Congress. I think I counted up 46 incumbent senators who are coming, U.S. senators, 64 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, a body that Richard Nixon served in for what, Bruce, 4 years?
4 years.
And then only 2 years in the Senate, but before he was plucked out and chosen to be Dwight Eisenhower's running mate.
Suppose you could argue it was the House that first really made him a national figure. The Alger Hiss case, pumpkin papers and all that, was in the headlines pretty steadily. And made him prominent to a degree that back then, certainly, freshmen in the House weren't really supposed to be.
It was really extraordinary because he was offered an opportunity to serve on the so-called House Un-American Affairs Committee, and this was a committee I guess a lot of members of Congress didn't want anything to do with, but it was something Nixon decided was a good move for him, and he jumped at the chance.
Well, it was, of course. Harry Truman always used to say the most un-American thing in America was the House Un-American Activities Committee, but he was feuding with it full time. It did wonderful things for the new congressman from California.
Michael Beschloss, what was it about the Hiss case that attracted Nixon's attention? Why did he decide that that was a smart move for him?
I think he saw that that was something that was going to be a rising tide in American politics, anti-communism, and perhaps attention to the internal threat from without. And I think also you have to look at the fact that Richard Nixon throughout his career was a gambler. And it was very possible at the beginning of this case that Hiss would be proven to be innocent. Nixon would have looked very silly, and that might have been the end of his political career. As a matter of fact, there was at least one moment during the Hiss case where it looked as if that would happen, and Nixon did say to himself, this is the end of me in politics.
And it was several years, or at least a couple of years anyway, before Senator Joseph McCarthy and what so many people think is the height of the anti-communist fervor in this country. This was really at the beginning of it. Richard Nixon was right in there. Here we see President Clinton coming down the stairs from Air Force One. The plane has been sitting there on the runway for just a few moments, and here's the president being greeted by a military contingent. We don't have any reason to believe that Mr. Clinton will linger at this air base. He's joined by Speaker of the House, Tom Foley, the Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, who announced, as we all know recently, he's stepping down this year, Linda Johnson Robb, daughter of the former president, and her husband, Senator Chuck Robb, of Virginia. You want to help me, Bruce, with some of the people? We're seeing a few faces there. Defense Secretary William Perry, Carol Browner. Now, there's an interesting face. Now, why would the head of the Environmental Protection Agency come? And the connection, I guess, most of us would make is that Richard Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agency.
There's George McGovern. Who, as you said earlier, did so well in 1972, carrying one state of the District of Columbia against Mr. Nixon.
Pat Moynihan, now the senator from the great state of New York, but who worked in the Nixon White House. Nixon plucked him out of, what, a Harvard professorship and
I think so, yes.
Brought him into the White House to work, set him up as, I guess, running one of the several domestic policy staffs that he had in the White House. There we see Jim Schlesinger, who was one of the secretaries of defense, one of three secretaries of defense under Nixon. Vernon Jordan just passed through, a Washington lawyer, former head of the Urban League. Bob Strauss,
yeah.
Former ambassador to Russia, former head of the Democratic Party. Herb Stein, who was an economist, was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Richard Nixon and his wife. This is a group of people who would not come together.
And there
we see.
Now that's not at El Toro, that's here at the library, and that is, of course, the former Vice President, Spiro Agnew.
Who looks, I guess you would say, Bruce, pretty much the same as he did. Maybe aged a few years. He's 75, I think, by our count.
Looks not very different, really, from the day he left office under a cloud.
He left under an agreement that he would plead guilty to tax evasion and was put on probation for 3 years, and then 8 or 10 years later he had to pay, I think it was $250,000 in a fine after it was reported that he had been bribed and accepted bribes as governor of Maryland and as vice president.
This is almost the first time anybody's seen him, I think, since he resigned the vice presidency. He really disappeared.
He truly did. There are going to be some faces that bring back memories in this crowd. There's no question. Now we're back at El Toro, where President Clinton is getting into the limousine. He's there with Mrs. Clinton. That motorcade will take, if yesterday's procession is any help, that motorcade should take about 20-25 minutes to get here from El Toro, to get here at Yorba Linda. And we will bring you further coverage of the ceremonies here at the Nixon Library, preparing for funeral services, which will begin a little over an hour when we come back. We are back at the Richard Nixon birthplace in Yorba Linda, California, the Richard Nixon Library, where his body lies in a casket inside these buildings. And just outside, hundreds of people who knew Richard Nixon at different parts of his life have come to pay their respects and to get together to remember this man who had a remarkable political career. We are looking around this crowd now for some faces many of us have not seen in a long time. A few moments ago, we spotted the former Vice President Spiro Agnew, who resigned in disgrace 21 years ago from office. You're seeing some of the dignitaries pulling up in the front. This is, I'm told, the car of former President Jimmy Carter, who arrived not long ago at the El Toro Marine Air Station with his wife Rosalind. They should be getting out of the car. If not them, it's another dignitary. We are told that I think it's Prince Hassan of Morocco is coming today. I'm here with Bruce Morton back in the area behind the library and the Richard Nixon birthplace. We're watching, Bruce, the crowd continue to build the area immediately behind us. We're seeing members of Congress. We're also joined in Washington by historian Michael Beschloss.
In fact, Judy, could I say a word on Spiro Agnew, what we saw just a moment ago?
Please do. Chime in.
Well, there's an example of the numerous ironies that we're going to see during the next few hours. Spiro Agnew, who has not seen Richard Nixon really since he resigned in October of 1973, and wrote a book a number of years later, a memoir which was called Go Quietly or Else, in which he documented the effort of Richard Nixon and the people around him to get him to resign as vice president after these charges that Bruce referred to were brought against him. The memoir even went so far as to make the suggestion that Alexander Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, had suggested in some indirect way that Spiro Agnew might incur physical danger to himself unless he resigned. So now you see Agnew and Nixon reunited under very different circumstances.
That was surely one of the most difficult periods in the life of Richard Nixon. 1973, Bruce, Watergate was heating up on into 74, but in 73, they not only had Watergate to deal with, they had this brewing scandal around their vice president.
And I think they really hadn't foreseen that. You know, there was almost a tradition of crookedness in Maryland politics in the years before Spiro Agnew became governor. There'd been a lot of, well, there's another former president, Gerald Ford.
Talking, I think, with Governor Pete Wilson and his wife Gail. There's Betty Ford. This is one of those rare times when we are going to see every living ex-president together. I guess they were gathered here, what, in 1990, when this library was dedicated. Richard Nixon brought them together 4 years ago, and today they are together again. Except this time there's another president, and that is William Jefferson Clinton. This is, I believe, Lenore Annenberg, although I don't see her husband, Walter Annenberg. Pete Wilson, whom we were just saying, governor of California. You were just saying, Bruce, that period in 1973 was, even though there'd been corruption in Maryland politics, well, they didn't necessarily know this was coming.
There'd been a lot of investigation, and Agnew was clean as far as anybody knew. The New York Times had assigned a reporter full-time for 6 months and never got anything. And all of a sudden, here was the scandal, which was not simply criminal, but small bore, almost sordid, you know, free groceries, free cash for a sitting vice president. And I'm sure the Nixon administration was just stunned by that.
Nixon said at the end of his life that he wished he had been stronger during Watergate, and he said that had he been, he would have been more helpful to Agnew and helped him to fight.
All right, on that note, we're going to continue to cover these preparations for the funeral, which will begin a little more than 1 hour from now. Our coverage will continue in just a moment. Dignitaries are arriving by the scores here in Yorba Linda, California, to say goodbye to Richard Milhous Nixon. Our coverage of the funeral services for the 37th President of the United States will continue. But first, we want to let our local cable operators get in a break. Yeah, that's right. You would think so.
Ian Blackman.
Adlai Stevenson, who was a Democratic presidential candidate in 1956, said of Richard Nixon, "This is a man of many masks. Who can say they have seen his real face?" Well, whether this crowd has seen the real face of Richard Nixon or not, they have come to pay their final respects today. Some 2,500 people, many of them famous, faces we will recognize and we'll try to identify if you don't already know who they are, and some of them just ordinary citizens. who had some connection with the family. Joining Bruce Morton and me here in the CNN stand, just adjacent to where this crowd is gathered, is CNN's Wolf Blitzer, who is our senior White House correspondent. Wolf, you've come, I guess, just ahead of President Clinton. Tell us what the White House, the kind of effort that the White House put into helping make today's ceremony possible.
Well, Judy, the White House wanted to make sure that everything was done to show the appropriate respect and honor for President Nixon. Everything that the family asked the White House to do, the White House was more than willing to do. The president going out of his way to underscore his deep appreciation of all of the assistance this past year and a half that he received from President Nixon, not only on international issues, but on other matters as well. President Clinton says he felt a special bond with President Nixon for several reasons. First and foremost, there is a very small club of presidents, as you know, and all of the presidents feel a kinship of sorts. But there's also no doubt that both have suffered political setbacks, managed to come back, and there's no doubt that when the president met with Mr. Nixon in March of '93, shortly after the inauguration, they developed a relationship that was to last up until the very end, almost a month before Mr. Nixon died. He wrote a lengthy letter to Mr. Clinton about his recent trip to Russia, underscoring some of the problems there. And President Clinton will no doubt once again say that that was one of the most lucid explanations of the current situation in the former Soviet Union that he had read in a long time. So there is a bond, there is a friendship, and when the president speaks in his eulogy, he will make it clear that he really respects and admires Mr. Nixon, even though, of course, they disagreed on the Vietnam War. Watergate came in between all of that. Those words probably won't be mentioned directly, but there will be some indirect references in the president's eulogy.
Not to mention the criticism that we know Richard Nixon expressed up until very recently. The memoirs that are being published not very just this week. We're looking now at a picture of the delegation from Japan who are arriving here at these services. They're being greeted by California Governor Pete Wilson and his wife. But as we were saying, the memoirs that I know some of them were published this week in, I'm sorry, I'm calling them memoirs, but
in Time Magazine.
Comments, that's right, in Time Magazine, in which Richard Nixon was very critical of President Clinton's health care reform plan and much of his domestic policy across the board.
That's right. He was very critical, not only on international issues, insisting the president was not showing enough attention, paying enough attention to international issues, but also on some of the major domestic issues, especially health care reform. He said that the 1,300-page Clinton proposal was merely a prescription for big government intervening in something that government should not be doing. And so his criticism was, if you read the excerpts in Time Magazine, excerpts from his book that is going to be coming out in May entitled Beyond Peace, Mr. Nixon himself said that would probably be his last book, the last of 10 books. The criticism of the Clinton administration was pretty harsh. President Clinton is not walking away from that criticism. He knows that Mr. Nixon had some unpleasant things to say about his administration, but at the same time, he wants to go beyond that, and he will try to underscore that Mr. Nixon should go down in history not only for some of the mistakes he made, of course, including Watergate, but for the totality of his administrations, especially the international breakthroughs with China and the then Soviet Union.
Roger Stone, who was a longtime aide to Richard Nixon, worked in his campaign in 1972 as a very young man, and over the years has maintained touch with him, was telling me just a few hours ago here today that for all Richard Nixon's reluctance to reach out and offer advice to presidents, when it came to Bill Clinton, he decided that he would reach out in the international arena, and that he went out of his way to be available to talk about, as you suggested a moment ago, Russia,
I think there is
China.
I think there is, Judy, a little disappointment in the White House because of those international breakthroughs that Mr. Nixon did achieve while he was president. There's a sense, indeed a surprise among some of the White House officials I've been talking to the past 24 hours, that no sitting heads of state or heads of government came to this funeral. They had anticipated that several world leaders would show up, and while many countries are, of course, represented, the fact that no sitting international leader is here is a source of some disappointment to the White House.
That's right. We have, we noted earlier, the Deputy Premier of China is here, the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. But Bruce Morton, why would that be? I've seen some speculation about why it is.
Well, I think for one thing, Judy, the world has simply changed so much since Richard Nixon's time. I mean, there isn't a Soviet Union anymore. The leadership of China, those are men he knew, but they're all in their 80s, and it's probably unrealistic to expect a Deng Xiaoping to go 12,000 miles to come to an event like this. But the map has changed, and the current Prime Minister of Britain isn't somebody who knew Richard Nixon well, for instance. The current Chancellor of Germany knew him, but again, they weren't shaping events together. And really, the world leaders who might have come are Mr. Nixon's age, more or less.
And it's also may well be the fact, Bruce and Wolf, the fact that this is a service that's being held in California. And so often when these heads of state come to the United States, they expect to do more than one thing. I mean, certainly it would be important for them to attend the funeral service, but they would also hope to have a meeting with President Clinton, perhaps, or with someone, perhaps with Secretary Christopher. He happens to be out of the country right now, traveling overseas. And this is a service being held in California. It's not as conducive to having these other kinds of meetings.
And Mr. Clinton, I think, said that he was not going to do any business at this event, that this was one thing that he wanted to do, and he was then going back to Washington. It's not like some other state funerals where there were meetings with this prime minister or that.
That's right. But having said that, Wolf, there are, I understand the State Department extended an invitation to many, many countries,
That's
and
right.
55 of them are sending ambassadors. Now we're looking at a picture at former President Ronald Reagan, who served in office for 8 years, as we well remember, with his wife Nancy. He's waving to reporters, no doubt, who are asking him a question. He will be among the former presidents, along with President Clinton, who will be sitting on the front row here just in front of the platform. You can see that big empty area. Wolf, I guess, I don't know exactly where you're standing, Wolf.
I'm standing, Judy, right in front of the opening to the Richard Nixon Library and birthplace, and I was about 10 feet away from President Reagan and Nancy Reagan, Governor Wilson, Mrs. Wilson, when they walked in here, and I tried to get, of course, President Reagan's attention. I noticed that he was walking not as quickly as he used to when he was president. Obviously, age is beginning to creep up, even on President Reagan. He was smiling at us as he walked by, and one of the reporters, a couple of us, tried to get him to come over and say a few words, but clearly he wanted to go inside and get ready for this service.
At 83 years of age, he has outlived this president who played such a big role in his own political career. This was a president, Richard Nixon, who Ronald Reagan had strong feelings about, I think pro and con at different times. I'm Judy Woodruff, and we will be back with my colleagues Bruce Morton, Wolf Blitzer, Michael Beschloss, the historian in Washington, after this.
Here's Bob.
Away from the beginning of funeral services for Richard Nixon, you can see former President George Bush, his wife Barbara Bush, being greeted outside the Nixon Library. They are being escorted by California Governor Pete Wilson. This, as we've been pointing out this afternoon and evening, is one of those rare occasions when all the former presidents, living presidents, come together. These men, President Bush, President Carter, President Reagan, President Ford, were together 4 years ago when this library was dedicated. Today they are joined by yet another president, the current president, Bill Clinton. It is quite an extraordinary group of people. Former Vice President Dan Quayle, Vice President, as we all well remember, with Vice President under George Bush, is here in the crowd. There is Richard Nixon's brother, youngest brother, Edward, the only surviving brother. Edward was born in 1930, I believe it is, Bruce, if my memory serves.
Always the modest one in the family. When Mr. Nixon was running for president in 1968, Ed ran the mailroom. He said, well, there's something I can do well, and I'm out of the spotlight, and I'm happy there. And he stayed out of the spotlight pretty much. The president's older brother, Don, was selling Nixon burgers one year, trying to capitalize on the family.
Nixon burgers. forgotten about
Never had
those.
one.
Ladies and gentlemen,
We're starting to hear the loudspeaker here at the Nixon Library, the announcer telling people that they should begin to take their seats. There's a lot of milling around going on here, people seeing old friends, people they haven't seen in a long time, political allies and political enemies, shaking hands, comparing notes, reminiscing. Another shot of Dan Quayle, the former vice president.
Well, Judy, you were talking about, how many past presidents are here. We could have a lot of fun in this crowd trying to pick out how many presidential wannabes are here.
How many future presidents, or would be? That's
there's
right.
Mr. Quayle, who certainly may run again. We've seen Phil Gramm, the Texas senator, who everybody expects to run.
Bob Hope, he won't be running for president, but he's known a lot of presidents.
Sure has. Sure has.
Was very, I think he was close to Richard Nixon and certainly to Ronald Reagan. He visited the White House many times. Spiro Agnew again, one of those faces from the past we've been talking about this afternoon. It's just a remarkable collection of Americans. Some better known than others, but all of them in one way or another we can presume have a connection with Richard Nixon. Jack Kemp, candidate for president next go around, sitting with Edward Nixon, who I guess is at 63, is the youngest Nixon, the only surviving Nixon brother. There were 5 children in that family, 5 brothers. 2 of them died very young, one just a few years old. And there's Dan Quayle sitting alone.
That won't last.
That's right. Wolf Blitzer, you are standing in front of the library. Tell us what you know.
Well, there's no doubt that the guest list turned out to be a lot bigger than had originally been planned. Before Mr. Nixon died, after his stroke, there was a tentative plan for about 400 guests to come here, but that number grew dramatically, and I think they're now well positioned for about 1,800, perhaps even more, and they've expanded the bleachers into the parking lot and all of that.
We've been told 2,500 as a matter of fact.
Well, as of this morning when I left the White House, it was about 1,800, 2,000, and now it's probably 2,500 because a lot more people wanted to come. The White House really was trying to service the desires of the Nixon family, the Nixon Library, and doing whatever was possible to facilitate their requests. But basically, the guest list was put together by the Nixon family and the Nixon Library. But a lot more members of the Senate, a lot more members of the House of Representatives decided to come out on these 5 separate presidential planes that were made available for members of Congress, in addition to Air Force One, which brought this extraordinary assortment of current and former officials, indeed supporters of President Nixon and opponents of President Nixon here to Yorba Linda. But basically, the family and the library put this guest list together. A lot more people, Judy, wanted to come that they had space to accommodate.
By my count, there are 47 members of the United States Senate. We're starting to see some of them coming in. Senator Jesse Helms there, you can see, Republican, longtime Republican senator from the state of North Carolina. Senator Pete Domenici. There are Republicans and Democrats in that group. We saw Michael Beschloss. You can join with me on this. We saw a few minutes ago Pat Moynihan, the senator now from the state of New York, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, so critical to President Clinton's health care reform plan. And he was also a critical player in the Nixon White House, was he not?
He sure was, and he was the one who famously gave Richard Nixon a biography of Disraeli and told Nixon that he should be the new Disraeli, and actually has been giving Richard Nixon books from time to time, really up until Mr. Nixon's death. 2 images we also saw, Judy, a few minutes ago were those of G. Gordon Liddy and Rosemary Woods. G. Gordon Liddy, the famous operative who went to jail for his role in Watergate. Rosemary Woods, the Nixon secretary back to the beginning of the 1950s, who probably became, perhaps unfairly, best known to the American public as the possible person who caused that 18.5-minute gap on the Watergate tapes, which caused her to appear on the cover of various news magazines at the end of 1973, stretching with her finger on the dictaphone machine, showing how she might have caused that gap.
Did you, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of what you said. Did you say that you saw her in the crowd here?
She was in the crowd along with G. Gordon Liddy, and I think both of their presence, along with Spiro Agnew and so many others, show how much this really is a reconcilement of all the geological layers of Richard Nixon's life.
We're looking now at a picture of a present chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili. There are several uniforms in this crowd. He, of course, is being the highest ranking former Army general. And Shalikashvili being the gentleman on the right. There again, a picture of, you're seeing Dan Quayle talking. It looks like the back of the head, I was going to say, of Al D'Amato, but I'm wrong. I shouldn't have said that. It's not Al D'Amato. It's someone else with a familiar head, with a similar head.
You know, Judy, John, if you can hear me you out there?
I sure can.
We did just see General John Shalikashvili, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's here not only because he is the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the senior military officer at the Pentagon, of course, but he was also a young Army officer during Vietnam, served in Vietnam under President Nixon, so there's no doubt that he feels a rapport, a certain attachment that has brought him here to Yorba Linda for this funeral, like so many others who joined President Clinton aboard Air Force One.
Vietnam being one of the points of great achievement, and for others a reason to criticize the foreign policy of this president. We're gonna come back to you, Michael, in just a moment. We want to tell our audience that we're going to continue our live coverage of the preparations for this funeral, which will get underway in just about 40 minutes. Our coverage will continue in a moment. If anyone thought that the weather would be clear and predictable on this day of Richard Nixon's funeral, it has not been. We've gone from a clear, relatively clear morning to clouds to rain, and now we're back, Bruce Morton, we're back with sunshine, and then suddenly the clouds have come again, and it sounds like it's going to rain soon, but maybe not.
Well, this is truly the, if you don't like it, wait a minute, it'll change. California climate.
A day of contradictory weather, just like this president that we're here to talk about.
Character.
Bruce, we've been joined by our colleague Wolf Blitzer, White House correspondent, and Michael Beschloss, the historian, back in our Washington studio. Dan Quayle, we're looking out in the crowd, and other dignitaries. We're trying to point them out as we see them. Michael, you were going to make a comment just a minute ago, and then I cut you off.
No, you were very gracious, Judy. Two things. One is Vernon Walters, the general whom we saw on screen a few minutes ago. He was an old acquaintance of Richard Nixon's, and in the Nixon administration in 1970, there was a feeling among the Nixon staff that there should be a better job of keeping records of meetings in the Oval Office. And so they thought perhaps they should get Vernon Walters, who was a very good note-taker and also knew a dozen languages. Walters was called in to do the job, and he said, I'm a general, I'm supposed to command troops, not be a secretary taking notes. As a result, the White House aides came up with another solution, which was to secretly record everything that went on in the Oval Office. Had Vernon Walters been a little bit more eager to take that job, the course of history might have been very different. The other image we saw was Dan Quayle, who oddly enough got an assist from President Nixon after the election of 1988. Former President Nixon came down to Washington, met with Quayle, and then met with the press to say that he was very much impressed with Quayle's intellectual abilities, and he had some experience as vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years, he said, in having his own abilities underrated.
That's right. I had forgotten about that session. That brings back that
Well, I wanted
Bruce.
to say something about Vernon Walters. I'm indebted to Raleigh Evans, the columnist, for this story. It's his, not mine, but when Mr. Nixon was an ex-president, was at some conference with a bunch of people in different languages, and finally the interpreter had left, and the French delegate said something, and they're all looking at each other and say, well, Vernon Walters can do it. He speaks 14 languages. And Mr. Nixon held up a little tape recorder and said, never mind, I've taped the whole thing. Proving that he had a sense of humor about some of this, after all.
Well, you know, as we talk about taping systems, it was the Nixon people like to point out that there was a taping system in the White House under President Johnson, which they dismantled, the Nixon people did, as soon as they came into office. But then, as you pointed out, Michael, they reinstituted it a few years later.
And one purpose of that taping system was to assist this very library that you are sitting out in front of, you, Judy, and Bruce. One of the purposes of the tapes was to provide hours of records of historic conversations that could be edited and played for visitors.
That's one of the ironies in that,
Judy,
one
President
of the many
Clinton.
ironies. I was going to, Bruce, you want to tell us who's in that motorcade?
Judy, I was about to tell you, this is Wolf Blitzer. The President Clinton has now arrived here at the Richard Nixon Library. Former Vice President Quayle just walked in front of us. He's just going inside, but the Reverend Billy Graham and Governor Wilson of California are now shaking hands with the President, greeting him, and First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton walked around the back of the limousine, is shaking hands with Governor Wilson now and with the Reverend Billy Graham, and Mrs. Wilson, an embrace. Reverend Graham has been close to virtually all of the presidents who are here today, and is close to the President, President Clinton himself, and will be delivering the sermon during the course of this service.
He was certainly close to Richard Nixon. He delivered the eulogy at the funeral of Hannah Nixon, Richard Nixon's mother, in 1967. The two men met. I was noting the other day, they met very early on. I believe it was in 1949 or 50. It was very soon after Richard Nixon came to Washington. They were introduced through a mutual friend. You can see President Nixon, Hillary Rodham Clinton, coming now into the Richard Nixon Library, accompanied by California Governor Pete Wilson and the Reverend Billy Graham, as you just said.
I might mention, Judy, that the image of Bill Clinton standing next to Pete Wilson recalls the fact that in the last number of months, Richard Nixon has been telling friends that he suspected that Pete Wilson might be the nominee of the Republican Party in 1996, and what you might have been seeing was a picture of what Richard Nixon expected to see in that election year.
We told you a minute ago the weather was unpredictable, and the raindrops have started to fall out here on these hundreds and hundreds of distinguished people who are gathered for funeral services. Senator Tom Harkin, you can see standing there in the crowd, someone who ran for president a few years ago, was not successful. Democratic senator from the state of Iowa. I don't know what the contingency plans are, Bruce, if there's a little bit of rain right now, but the clouds are dark indeed, and the wind is kicking up just as it did yesterday, you know, just before the Nixon motorcade arrived here.
The wind's picked up a lot. The guy who could make a fortune here right now, of course, is the neighborhood umbrella salesman down in this crowd. I don't really know that there is a contingency plan. There's not enough, there's no other place to move this.
All right, we are, the event will go on regardless, but we'll see if they do have a contingency plan. Our coverage of the preparations for the funeral will continue, but first we want to let our local cable stations and their operators get in a break. We'll be back. Preparations continue here at the Richard Nixon Library for the funeral for the 37th president, scheduled to begin 30 minutes from now in Yorba Linda in Southern California. There you see one of the faces most noted in this crowd, former Vice President Spiro Agnew, who forced to resign from the vice presidency in 1973, standing there with his wife. We know that the dignitaries continue to arrive. The Annenberg family, we were seeing them earlier, the children of President and Mrs. Carter, the children of President and Mrs. Ford. Some of those children have been arriving here at the library. Others are gradually making their way to the seats. The band, the military band, which is here, has begun to play solemn music in the period leading up to the funeral. That was the face very quickly of Richard Nixon's only surviving brother, Edward Nixon, 63-year-old Edward Nixon, who lives in Seattle now, I believe it is.
The band is local. They're from the Marine Air Station at El Toro. It was the same band that played when the casket arrived there yesterday. The bass, which, by the way, is due to close. I don't know whether there's any significance in that, but it's on the list and is not expected to remain open more than another year or two.
Michael Beschloss, it isn't often that we have this, we've commented on this all afternoon, but that we have this sort of an unusual gathering of politicians and public figures from across the political spectrum. It seems that it happens at funerals and inaugurations and maybe not every inauguration. It happens at rare intervals in our political life as a country.
Yes, those are the rare cross-cutting events in American life, and I think very good events because there are so many others that divide us. Maybe more so in Richard Nixon's case because his life was in many ways in such different compartments. The people, for instance, whom Nixon knew in the Eisenhower administration, well, there's an example of whom I mean. There was one example, which is Gordon Liddy, the bald gentleman we saw at the right, an avatar of Watergate, the kind of person who would feel very strange in the same room with the kind of aides that Nixon had running for office in 1960, who were very much more of the Eisenhower Republican stripe.
Speaker Tom Foley, I just wanted to interrupt, we're seeing there, who's just come in, and there is Senator Moynihan, who we've been talking about this afternoon, followed by George McGovern. George McGovern was on the plane with President Clinton flying to California on Air Force One, and he talked to reporters for a few minutes about that campaign in 1972, when he lost to Richard Nixon.
He, in 1970...
I resented for a long time certain aspects of that campaign. For one thing, he absolutely refused any kind of joint appearance, to say nothing of debates. He had said to Hubert Humphrey 4 years earlier in that campaign that a candidate who would not debate his opponent wasn't qualified to be president of the United States, but he stoutly refused any kind of debate with me in '72 or a joint appearance, or even if he heard I was going to be in a particular city, he made sure he was not there in that city. And I thought that was a loss not only to me, but to the American public. I also resented the negative campaign ads, the prepared ads that were almost 100% negative against me. But after a couple of years, those things begin to fade, and you begin to see life in a little more balanced perspective. I guess I'm incapable of carrying a grudge very long against anybody.
Former South Dakota Senator George McGovern, Democratic candidate in 1972, commenting just a little while ago during the ride on Air Force One from New Jersey, or rather from Washington, D.C. to California. He was on the plane with President Clinton. He's now here at the library. Many of the faces we're seeing in the crowd now. There's Tony Lake, who is President Clinton's on the left, standing next to Reverend Graham. His back is to us. He's President Clinton's national security advisor. He worked, I believe, under Henry Kissinger in the Nixon White House.
He not only did that, but he resigned over the invasion of Cambodia in May of 1970.
And there you see George Shultz, Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, who served as Secretary of Labor in the Nixon administration. And we saw, another face we saw was that of Brent Scowcroft, who was National Security Advisor for President Bush, who was a deputy to Henry Kissinger in the Nixon administration.
You could make up a lot of interesting conversations, Judy, between some of these people. George McGovern and G. Gordon Liddy, for instance. Now, what would they talk about?
What would they talk about? Bruce, what do you think?
It's not, you know, the last batch of Watergate tapes that were played for reporters a year or so ago, Nixon and various aides were talking about, why don't we just cut it off with Liddy? Liddy will go to jail for us. Liddy's our kind of a guy. And we all went running over, of course, to Liddy afterwards for comment. He said, well, yes, I would have. Nobody ever asked me.
Characters from the Watergate era, and we should say that some of those who were so prominent in that whole affair are not here today. John Mitchell died some years ago.
H.R. Haldeman quite recently.
H.R. Haldeman died not long ago. We are seeing other dignitary, Jack Kemp and his wife, sitting on the front row. Wolf Blitzer, you've been getting a look at some of the people in this crowd.
Well, Judy, it's fascinating. I was standing here in front of the entrance to the library, and after the President and First Lady arrived and were received by Governor Wilson and the Reverend Billy Graham, within a few moments, the rest of the entourage aboard Air Force One arrived aboard these little vans that brought all these VIPs, and it was a mixed bag. Speaker Foley, of course, and Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. As they were walking in, being escorted, any one of them, no doubt, could have received his or her own special accommodations, but to see 30, 40, 50 of them walking together sort of as in a group following the White House press pool that was running into the ceremonies here. It was an unusual spectacle to see all of that going on, to say the least. I must say, Herb Stein, who was President Nixon's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is here with his wife, and they are obviously much older than many of the other people here, and they're having trouble a bit keeping up, but they clearly seemed excited and thrilled to be participating in this event.
That's right. In fact, we just saw him standing in the crowd just as you were mentioning his name. We're looking at some of the military representatives of the military who are attending here today, and when you see a purple pin, some people are wearing the small purple pin, others are wearing, I think, yellow and perhaps some other colors. They have the initials RN on them, and we have been told those are a security mark. When you're wearing one of those pins, it means you're okay, and you can come in, I guess, without going through the metal detector.
Well, it is invitation only, of course.
And security here is very, very tight. I must say this whole area around the library has been cordoned off by police and state troopers. Right. It's understandably so.
That's right, and I think you probably heard us talking earlier, Wolf. We had a security, what they call a security sweep, where they literally bring in dogs that sniff and people who check under every surface that they can get their hands on to see if everything.
Swept the journalists out and us off the air.
That's right. That is right.
I also spotted David Gergen. I don't know if we have a shot of him, but he, of course, worked for President Nixon in the Nixon administration, and now he works for President Clinton in the current White House. He has that unique experience. Tony Lake, the National Security Advisor under President Clinton, did work briefly as a young Foreign Service officer under Henry Kissinger, as Michael Beschloss was pointing out. But David Gergen reminisced the other day with me about his experiences working for these two very, very different presidents, and he could understand why they did develop this bond despite the generational differences and the political differences.
As we look at, continue to look at the faces in the crowd, Elliot Richardson, who resigned as Attorney General rather than fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, someone who played a very big role in the whole Watergate affair. As we continue to look at these people and to prepare for the services that will begin here in just about 15 or 20 minutes, we will take a break, but we will be right back. We are here at the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace in Yorba Linda, California, awaiting funeral services to begin shortly. Our coverage of this event will continue in a moment. More than 2,000 invited guests are gathered here at the Richard Nixon Memorial Library and Birthplace in Yorba Linda, California, to celebrate, to participate in the commemoration of the life and the death of this 37th President of the United States. Standing in front of the Nixon Library at this moment, CNN senior White House correspondent Wolf Blitzer. Wolf?
Judy, I'm joined by Senator Charles Robb of Virginia, the son-in-law of the late President Lyndon Johnson. You were aboard President Clinton's flight, the Air Force One, here with this extraordinary guest list. What was the mood aboard the plane?
Wolf, the mood was respectful. I think most of the people were talking about remembrances and shared experiences with President Nixon or other similar experiences that they'd had in their lives. And Some of the people had just written op-ed pieces, and we were kind of exchanging those op-ed pieces. As a matter of fact, the president stopped and read one that George McGovern had just written. It had appeared in one of the Washington newspapers, and he complimented the former senator on his piece, and he's certainly been very respectful and gracious in the way that he's handled the situation since he was his opponent in 1972.
What's your reading of President Clinton's assessment of President Nixon?
Well, I think it's clear that he looked to President Nixon for advice and counsel on difficult presidential issues and had felt that he was a very valuable resource in that regard, and I think held his advice and counsel as being important to him and to the country.
The last time the United States buried a president was 21 years ago, your father-in-law, President Lyndon Johnson. How does this experience compare with that one?
There are some similarities, certainly the fact that Dr. Reverend Billy Graham officiated then and is officiating again today, as well as the fact that on a bipartisan basis, most of the leadership of the country come to pay their respects, and I think that's entirely appropriate.
You have to get going, so I'll let you go, but thanks for stopping by.
Thank you very much.
Okay, back to you, Judy.
Thanks, Wolf. And we might point out that Chuck Robb's wife, of course, is Linda Johnson. Robb was a friend of both Tricia Nixon and Tricia Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower. In fact, the Robbs were one of the few political couples who were invited to Tricia Nixon's wedding, which was held in the White House in 1971. Was it, Bruce Morton? I believe that. Does that sound about right to you? Right. This is a wreath sent, you can read the name on this one, from Boris Yeltsin, the former leader of the Soviet Union. Extraordinary there. Richard M. Nixon from Boris N. Yeltsin. You can read it. And also up on the stand I saw there was a wreath with what appeared to me to be writing in Chinese, although I don't claim to read or understand Chinese. And I asked someone who said that they did know, and they said it came from the People's Republic of China, and there was a card on it that was signed by the Vice Premier, who was representing his country at today's ceremony. You can hear the military band playing several songs and numbers as we prepare for this event. I should say that in a moment I'm holding a copy of the program that all the people here have in their hands as they sit, and there's a picture of Richard Nixon in it, which looks as if it was taken some years ago. I don't know if you can catch it on camera, but this is the picture that the family chose to be in this program. And there's yet another picture in the back of the program where he's thumbs up. We will be back with more coverage of the funeral of Richard Nixon in just a moment. Washington, D.C. Here in Yorba Linda, California, the flag flies at half-staff at the Richard M. Nixon Memorial Library and Birthplace, where more than 2,500 guests have been invited to participate in the funeral services for Richard Nixon. Several hundred members of the news media are standing behind them, and as you can see, these services are being held on the grounds of the library and birthplace. This house we've been showing you for the last few days, here's another shot of the flag. This house we've been showing you for the last few days is the house that Frank Nixon built in 1912, and 1 year after that, about his son Richard Milhous Nixon, named Richard. His mother wanted to call him Richard after Richard the Lion-Hearted. She was a student of English history, and she named all of her sons, wasn't it, Bruce, after the English kings?
You could argue, I guess, that there's another comeback kid.
I suppose you could say that.
Well, he was held prisoner in Europe for some years, came back, reclaimed the crown from his wicked brother John. We all read about that when we were 10 years old. I defer to you on British history. I'm glad to let you talk about it. You and Michael Beschloss. I would point out quickly that's Bob Rubin, who is head of the Council on Economic Advisors in the Clinton White House. Again, it's such a mixture in this audience of Democrats, Republicans, Clinton White House, Reagan White House, Carter White House, and every other White House, literally, since Richard Nixon went out of office. Jerry Ford is here, Ronald Reagan is here. This is the flower arrangement I was mentioning a moment ago. On the left,
from the People's Republic of China. You can see the expression there of sympathy written in Chinese.
Well, I think if we're going to show two wreaths, those ought to be the two, you know, of all of the things Richard Nixon did in foreign affairs. The most enduring were détente with the then Soviet Union, and maybe most important of all, opening the door that had kept China sealed off from the United States for so long. You know, we'd had all those years after the war, who lost China, and he got us talking again.
Wolf Blitzer, we're looking at a picture at this moment of Henry Kissinger and his wife Nancy coming out behind the library. Wolf Blitzer, you are in front of the library, I'm told. I see Senator Dole coming along behind them. These are two of the speakers who will be participating in the services. Wolf Blitzer is with Mark Guerin, the White House Communications Director. Wolf?
That's right, Judy, and Mark is gracious enough to join us and express some of the thoughts that the President expressed to you aboard Air Force One. What's going through his mind right now?
Well, I think ultimately this is a day to honor the public service of Richard Nixon. The President brought out with him members of his cabinet, his staff. It was an interesting plane ride out with members of President Nixon's administration. There's many, many years of service on that plane of men who had given many years of their lives to public service. And this is a day to pay tribute to that and the many things he accomplished during his lifetime.
It was a long flight, 4.5, 5 hours. Who did the President talk to the most aboard that flight?
Well, he went around when he first got on the plane and visited with everyone, greeted them aboard Air Force One, and spent some time working on his remarks as well. So we had a good visit with the host of dignitaries that were on board his plane.
Is the President going to try to make his eulogy of President Nixon some sort of statement of healing after Watergate and Vietnam? Is that going to be one of the themes?
It's certainly one of the themes I think we've all seen this past week from commentators and from historians and from observers, that this is a time now to look on to the future, and I think we've seen that from a lot this whole past week.
The President has been very gracious in trying to do everything the Nixon family wanted. Any second thoughts about that in the White House?
No, absolutely not. It's appropriate. We're honored to be here.
Okay, Mark Guerin, White House Communications Director, thanks for stopping by. Judy?
Wolf, this is President Jimmy Carter, his wife Rosalind. We're told that they arrived at the library earlier than they had planned to originally because they wanted to tour the library and see a museum and see what was inside it. President Carter has raised the money over the last number of years to build an impressive structure, his own presidential library in Atlanta. And it's not at all surprising that he would want to get a good look at the Nixon Library. This is former President Reagan, his wife Nancy, making their way from the library along the colonnade out to the area where the funeral will be held. George Bush, who succeeded Ronald Reagan, having served as his vice president for 8 years. This is a succession of the political giants in the history of the United States in the last 20, 30 years. Bruce Morton, here comes President Clinton, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Republicans, Democrats. This is the political history of the United States we're looking at today since 1960, what is it, 1968?
68, Mr. Nixon's first term. They are really the last arriving guests, of course, as you know, Judy. You see them all coming down just behind us here, walking to seats which have been saved for them. And that really means that we've seen everybody who will be involved in this except the family. They'll come in last of all.
That's right. We also saw President Ford coming. Now here are the members of the Nixon family. Julie Nixon Eisenhower, her husband David, their daughter Melanie, and we didn't see Tricia Nixon Cox and her husband. Here is President Carter. Back now to the front of the library where the Coxes and the Eisenhowers are being greeted by the Reverend Billy Graham. It was the Nixon family that very specifically asked, no doubt at the request of Richard Nixon, that this funeral be held in California, period, that there not be a service in Washington, D.C. The crowd is applauding as the former presidents arrive. We see coming down the stairs right now President Reagan. The crowd broke out in applause at his appearance and walking with his wife Nancy. Applauding President Bush, Barbara Bush. And people standing and applauding, standing at the arrival of President Clinton and Hillary Rodham Clinton. We expect that any minute now the two daughters of President Nixon will make their way to the area behind the birthplace to join the assembled group here in this area. The people you're seeing right here include the former presidents and those who will be speaking today. California Governor Pete Wilson, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, President Clinton will be the last speaker, we've been told, just before the eulogy by Billy Graham. Wolf Blitzer, you've been talking to some of these people as they've been coming in.
Well, we just saw, of course, the family, the immediate family, the two daughters, Tricia and Julie Eisenhower, Tricia Cox, and their husbands as they walked in with their kids. They were led by the Reverend Billy Graham. They were the last of the official guests to arrive appropriately. They are now inside and getting ready to begin this service in honor of their father. But they seem very, very somber, which is understandable given the enormity of this day and all the memories that must have been flowing back through their minds over these past several days. But the Reverend Graham, no doubt, is a source of tremendous support for them as they are about to begin this service.
And as you said earlier, here they are now. They are coming out of the library. This is Christopher Cox with his parents, Tricia Nixon Cox and her husband Edward, followed by the Eisenhowers, David and Julie Eisenhower, and their 3 children. These are, of course, the 2 daughters of Pat Nixon, who died last June the 22nd, 10 months to the day before she died of lung cancer, 10 months to the day before her husband, Richard Nixon, died.
It was a very close family, too, I think, more than a lot of families. I remember Julie Nixon Eisenhower was such a battler for her father all during Watergate. You could just feel what a strong bond that was between father and daughter.
She crossed the country, you're right, making speeches
made
for
speeches,
him.
held news conferences, took on all comers. She was just a fighter for him.
She was the daughter who was willing to be out in public and speaking out. Tricia Nixon Cox is the one who always wanted, who shunned the public eye and really wanted her privacy, and she was that way from the very beginning.
I think in that sense.
That's right. For Pat Nixon, about whom Julie Nixon Eisenhower has written a book, public life was a very painful thing for her, and it was very hard for her to finally, I know, to go along with the decision for Richard Nixon to run for president again in 1968, which so many people now know that he wanted to do as soon as he lost the election for governor of California in 1962. He almost immediately started making plans to run again in 1968. This has been a difficult year for this family. As we were just saying, they lost, these daughters lost their mother in June of 1993, and now 10 months later they are here to commemorate the life of their father, who adored his grandchildren, we're told. One of the reasons he moved back east in 1980, what year was it, 87?
87, I think.
No, it was before that. It was 1979, I think it was.
You're right.
It was 1979, I misspoke. He came back east. He said one of the reasons was to be with his grandchildren, and there's every reason to believe that that was the case, but he also wanted to be, as he said, in the arena. He wanted to be where the action was.
Yeah, I think he felt the East Coast was simply a better place from which to emerge as an elder statesman. The media were there, foreign leaders came to New York and Washington more than to California.
Eisenhower and Cox families now taking their seats on the front row, along with the seats of the former presidents and President Clinton.
of respect for the President and the Nixon family, we ask that the guests at the services refrain from all still and video photography. Please rise for the playing of honors and remain standing till the casket is placed on the chancel.
On behalf of the family of Richard Nixon, I welcome you who have gathered to join with them in paying final respects to the memory of Richard Milhous Nixon, the 37th President of the United States. Today, in this service, we remember with gratitude his life, his accomplishments, and we give thanks to God for those things he did to make our world a better place. Through this service, may our dedication to serving others be deepened, and may our eyes be lifted to that which is eternal. Let us hear the word of the Lord. Our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. Our God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Now, we have a program. You all have one, and we're going to follow that program without any further announcement. You may be seated. Thank you.
During the final week of Richard Nixon's life, I often imagined how he would have reacted to the tide of concern, respect, admiration, and affection evoked by his last great battle. His gruff pose of never paying attention to media comment would have been contradicted by a warm glow and the ever so subtle hint that another recital of the commentary would not be unwelcome. And without quite saying so, he would have conveyed that it would mean a lot to him if Julie and Tricia, David and Ed were told of his friend's pride in this culmination to an astonishing life. When I learned the final news, by then so expected, yet so hard to accept, I felt a profound void. In the words of Shakespeare, he was a man, take him for all in all, I shall not look upon his like again. In the conduct of foreign policy, Richard Nixon was one of the seminal presidents. He came into office when the forces of history were moving America from a position of dominance to one of leadership. Dominance reflects strength. Leadership must be earned. And Richard Nixon earned that leadership role for his country with courage, dedication, and skill. When Richard Nixon took his oath of office, 550,000 Americans were engaged in combat in a place as far away from the United States as it was possible to be. America had no contact with China, the world's most populous nation, no negotiations with the Soviet Union, the other nuclear superpower. Most Muslim countries had broken diplomatic relations with the United States, and Middle East diplomacy was stalemated. All of this in the midst of the most anguishing domestic crisis since the Civil War. When Richard Nixon left office, an agreement to end the war in Vietnam had been concluded, and the main lines of all subsequent policy were established. Permanent dialogue with China, readiness without illusions to ease tensions with the Soviet Union, a peace process in the Middle East, the beginning via the European Security Conference of establishing human rights as an international issue, weakening Soviet hold on Eastern Europe. Richard Nixon's foreign policy goals were long range, and he pursued them without regard to domestic political consequences. When he considered our nation's interest at stake, he dared confrontations despite the imminence of elections and also in the midst of the worst crisis of his life. And he bore, if with some pain, the disapproval of longtime friends and allies over relaxing tensions with China and the Soviet Union. He drew strength from a conviction he often expressed to me. The price for doing things halfway is no less than for doing it completely. so we might as well do them properly. Thus, Richard Nixon's greatest accomplishment was as much moral as it was political. To lead from strength at a moment of apparent weakness, to husband the nation's resilience, and thus to lay the basis for victory in the Cold War. Shy and withdrawn, Richard Nixon made himself succeed in the most gregarious of professions and steeled himself to conspicuous acts of extraordinary courage in the face of wrenching domestic controversy. He held fast to his basic theme that the greatest free nation in the world had a duty to lead and no right to abdicate. Richard Nixon would be so proud that President Clinton and all living former presidents of the United States are here, symbolizing that his long and sometimes bitter journey had concluded in reconciliation. I wish that in his final hours, I could have told him about Brian MacDonald, who during the Cambodian crisis had been fasting on a bench in Lafayette Park across from the White House until, as he said, President Nixon redeemed his pledge to withdraw American forces from that anguished country in 2 months, a promise which was in fact kept. Across the chasm of the decades, Brian called me the day Richard Nixon fell ill and left a message. When you talk to President Nixon, tell him that I'm praying for him. So let us now say goodbye to our gallant friend. He stood on pinnacles that dissolved into precipice. He achieved greatly and he suffered deeply. But he never gave up. In his solitude, he envisaged a new international order that would reduce lingering enmities, strengthen historic friendships, and give new hope to mankind. A vision where dreams and possibilities conjoined. Richard Nixon ended a war. He advanced the vision of peace of his Quaker youth. He was devoted to his family. He loved his country, and he considered service his honor. It was a privilege to have been allowed to help him.
I believe the second half of the 20th century will be known as the age of Nixon. Why was he the most durable public figure of our time? Not because he gave the most eloquent speeches, but because he provided the most effective leadership. Not because he won every battle, but because he always embodied the deepest feelings of the people he led. One of his biographers said that Richard Nixon was one of us, and so he was. He was a boy who heard the train whistle in the night and dreamed of all the distant places that lay at the end of the track. How American. He was the grocer's son who got ahead by working harder and longer than everyone else. How American. He was a student who met expenses by doing research at the law library for 35 cents an hour while sharing a rundown farmhouse without water or electricity. How American. He was the husband and father who said that the best memorial to his wife was her children. How American. To tens of millions of his countrymen, Richard Nixon was an American hero. A hero who shared and honored their belief in working hard, worshiping God, loving their families, and saluting the flag. He called them the silent majority. Like them, they valued accomplishment more than ideology. They wanted their government to do the decent thing, but not to bankrupt them in the process. They wanted his protection in a dangerous world, but they also wanted creative statesmanship in achieving a genuine peace with honor. These were the people from whom he had come, and who have come to Yorba Linda these past few days by the tens of thousands, no longer silent in their grief. The American people love a fighter, and in Dick Nixon they found a gallant one. In her marvelous biography of her mother, Julie recalls an occasion where Pat Nixon expressed amazement at her husband's ability to persevere in the face of criticism, to which the president replied, "I just get up every morning to confound my enemies." It was what Richard Nixon did after he got up every morning that not just confounded his enemies, but turned them into admirers. It is true that no one knew the world better than Richard Nixon. And as a result, the man who was born in a house his father built would go on to become this century's greatest architect of peace. But we should also not underestimate President Nixon's domestic achievements, for it was Richard Nixon who ended the draft, strengthened environmental and nutritional programs, and committed the government to a war on cancer. He leapfrogged the conventional wisdom to propose revolutionary solutions to health care and welfare reform, anticipating by a full generation the debates now raging on Capitol Hill. I remember the last time I saw him at a luncheon held in the Capitol honoring the 25th anniversary of his first inaugural. Without a note, President Nixon stood and delivered a compelling speech, capturing the global scene as only he could and sharing his vision of America's future. When it was over, he was surrounded by Democrats and Republicans alike, each wanting just one more word of Nixonian counsel, one more insight into world affairs. Afterward, the president rested in my office before leaving the Capitol, only he got very little rest. For the office was filled with young Hill staffers, members of the Capitol Police, and many, many others, all hoping to shake his hand, get an autograph, or simply convey their special feelings for a man who truly was one of us. Today, our grief is shared by millions of people the world over, but it is also mingled with intense pride in a great patriot who never gave up and who never gave in. To know the secret of Richard Nixon's relationship with the American people, you need only to listen to his own words. You must never be satisfied with success, he told us, and you should never be discouraged by failure. Failure can be sad, but the greatest sadness is not to try and fail, but to fail to try. In the end, what matters is that you have always lived life to the hilt. Strong, brave, unafraid of controversy, unyielding in his convictions, living every day of his life to the hilt, the largest figure of our time, whose influence will be timeless. That was Richard Nixon. How American. May God bless Richard Nixon.
And may God bless the United States.
Richard Nixon has a beautiful family, and he was devoted to them. Anyone who ever saw him together knew that his beloved Pat and his girls, Tricia and Julie, were everything to him. He was so proud of them, of his sons-in-law, Edward and David, and of his grandchildren. But he also had a much larger, extended family, a family of those who worked for him and with him. And I was and am very lucky to be a part of that family. I was one of the many young men and women in whom he inspired the same fierce loyalty that he gave to us. From the first, I was struck by the quality of his personal generosity. When we met in 1962, he'd already debated Khrushchev and President Kennedy. He'd already run for president. He'd been a major political figure on the world stage. But still, he had time to talk to and to help an eager young advance man who could offer him little but energy and enthusiasm. Then in the fall of 1965, when I was 32, he honored me by asking me to come to work with him on his potential bid for the presidency in 1968. But he'd heard from Bob Finch and Herb Klein that I was thinking about running for office myself. I told him it was true, and he grinned. He grinned and he said, in that deep, rich voice of his, "Is it a good district? Can you win?" And then he said, "Because if you can, then Pete, you've got to try, or you'll never forgive yourself." I was just another young lawyer trying to find his way in the world, and he was a former vice president preparing a bid for the highest office in the land. And yet, that day, he was as concerned with my future as he was with his own. Time and again, not just with me, but with many others, he was always there, willing to share his insight and his experience. And no American in this century had more of either to share. It's hard to imagine a world without Richard Nixon. For half a century, he played a leading role in shaping the events that have shaped our lives. It's not just that he served for 3 decades in high office. It's not just that he garnered more votes than any candidate in American history. It was because his intellect, his insight, and his indomitable will could not be ignored. He moved on the world stage. He voiced bold ideas, and he left global footprints. But for all his world grasp and mastery of global strategy, it was right here in this small house, in this little town in Orange County, that Richard Nixon learned and never forgot the values that shaped him and helped him shape our world. He learned the value of hard work. He learned that to make important change, you must take risks. And he learned the Quaker virtue that if you were born with a good mind and good health, you were obliged to help others, to give back to your community. But he had something more, much more. When most people think of Richard Nixon, they think of his towering intellect, the incisive quality of his mind. Well, I will always remember him for another quality. It's the quality the great fighters have. They call it heart. Heart is what let Richard Nixon climb back into the ring time and again when almost anyone else would have thrown in the towel. It was his heart that taught us the great lesson of Richard Nixon's life to never, ever give up. To him, it was no disgrace to fight and be beaten. The only disgrace was to quit, and he never did. Like this Golden State that bred and shaped him, he knew adversity was a challenge to overcome. He loved returning to California, and he shared California's optimism. And as he saw the state he loved facing the harshest economic times since the Great Depression, his message to us was, keep walking, keep working, and keep fighting, and you'll come back better than before. The world will remember Richard Nixon, rightly, as a fighter of iron will. But the greatness of a man can sometimes be best measured by the times and the reasons that he chooses not to fight. After the 1960 election, many urged Richard Nixon to contest one of the closest and most controversial elections in American history. But Richard Nixon said no. He would not go to court, he refused to fight, and he urged others not to on his behalf. He would relinquish the prize that was his life's ambition. Why? For a simple, but these days, remarkable reason. It was because he so loved his country that he refused to risk its being torn apart by the constitutional crisis that might ensue. Forgive my parochial pride, but in this modest home, just a few feet from this stand, was bred a grocer's son and a great American, with deep love for his country, with limitless courage, and above all, with a faith and the brimming spirit and energy that creates only a handful of great leaders from among the tens of millions of their fellow citizens. Dick Nixon's heart, shaped by the grit and mores of this small town, never left California. And now we return it to the soil that bred him. He ended his own eulogy to Everett Dirksen with a favorite quotation from the poet Sophocles. One must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been. In Richard Nixon's evening, his light burned bright with hope and wise prescriptions for America and for the world. Today, as we take him to rest, as we seek to measure the greatness of the man and his legacy, it is clear how truly splendid Richard Nixon's day has been.
President Nixon opened his memoirs with a simple sentence. I was born in a house my father built. Today we can look back at this little house and still imagine a young boy sitting by the window of the attic he shared with his three brothers, looking out to a world he could then himself only imagine. From those humble roots, as from so many humble beginnings in this country, grew the force of a driving dream. A dream that led to the remarkable journey that ends here today, where it all began. Beside the same tiny home mail-ordered from back east, near this towering oak tree, which back then was a mere seedling. President Nixon's journey across the American landscape mirrored that of his entire nation in this remarkable century. His life was bound up with the striving of our whole people, with our crises and our triumphs. When he became president, he took on challenges here at home on matters from cancer research to environmental protection, putting the power of the federal government where Republicans and Democrats had neglected to put it in the past. In foreign policy, he came to the presidency at a time in our history when Americans were tempted to say we had had enough of the world. Instead, he knew we had to reach out to old friends and old enemies alike. He would not allow America to quit the world. Remarkably, he wrote 9 of his 10 books after he left the presidency, working his way back into the arena he so loved by writing and thinking and engaging us in his dialogue. For the past year, even in the final weeks of his life, he gave me his wise counsel, especially with regard to Russia. One thing in particular left a profound impression on me. Though this man was in his 9th decade, he had an incredibly sharp and vigorous and rigorous mind. As a public man, he always seemed to believe the greatest sin was remaining passive in the face of challenges, and he never stopped living by that creed. He gave of himself with intelligence and energy and devotion to duty, and his entire country owes him a debt of gratitude for that service. Oh yes, he knew great controversy amid defeat as well as victory. He made mistakes, and they, like his accomplishments, are part of his life and record. But the enduring lesson of Richard Nixon is that he never gave up being part of the action and passion of his times. He said many times that unless a person has a goal, a new mountain to climb, his spirit will die. Well, based on our last phone conversation and the letter he wrote me just a month ago, I can say that his spirit was very much alive to the very end. That is a great tribute to him, to his wonderful wife, Pat, to his children and to his grandchildren, whose love he so depended on and whose love he returned in full measure. Today is a day for his family, his friends, and his nation to remember President Nixon's life in totality. To them, let us say, may the day of judging President Nixon on anything less than his entire life and career come to a close. May we heed his call to maintain the will and the wisdom to build on America's greatest gift, its freedom, to lead a world full of difficulty to the just and lasting peace he dreamed of. As it is written in the words of a hymn I heard in my church last Sunday, grant that I may realize that the trifling of life creates differences, but that in the higher things we are all one. In the twilight of his life, President Nixon knew that lesson well. It is, I feel certain, a faith he would want us all to keep. And so, on behalf of all 4 former presidents who are here, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, and on behalf of a grateful nation, we bid farewell to Richard Milhous Nixon.
The great king of ancient Israel, David, said on the death of Saul, who had been a bitter enemy, "Know ye not that there is a prince and a great man fallen this day in Israel?" Today, we remember that with the death of Richard Nixon, a great man has fallen. We've heard that the world has lost a great citizen, and America has lost a great statesman. And those of us that knew him have lost a personal friend. You know, few events touch the heart of every American as profoundly as the death of a president. For the president is our leader, and every American feels that he knows him in a very special way because he hears his voice so often, sees him on television, reads about him in the press. And so we all mourn his loss and feel that our world is a bit lonelier without him. But to you who were close to him, this grief is an added pain because you wept when he wept and you laughed when he laughed. And here amidst these familiar surroundings under these California skies, his earthly life has come full circle. It was here that Richard Nixon was born and reared and his life was molded. But the scripture teaches that there's a time to be born, a time to live, and a time to die. Richard Nixon's time to die came last Friday evening. Since 1990, he had had a brilliant young cardiologist as his doctor by the name of Jeffrey Bora. And last Tuesday, the day after the president suffered his stroke, the doctor came by the New York hospital to examine him. He was partially paralyzed and could not speak, but he was still alert. And as the doctor talked, the president reached out and grabbed his arm with an unusual strength. Then as the doctor turned to leave, something made him turn around and look back to the bed where Richard Nixon was lying. And just at that moment, the president waved and gave his trademark thumbs up signal and smiled. That took determination, which he had, and we've heard about already today. It was an example of fighting on and never giving up that Jeffrey Bora will never forget. Now, President Nixon's great voice, his warm, intelligent eyes, his generous smile are missed as we gather here again, just 10 months after we were here when his beloved Pat went to heaven. A few months ago, he was asked in a television interview, "How would you like to be remembered?" He thought a moment and then he replied, "I'd like to be remembered as one who made a difference." And he did make a difference in our world, as we've heard so eloquently this afternoon. There's an old saying that a tree is best measured when it's laid down. The great events of his life have already been widely recounted by the news media this week, and it's not my purpose to restate what others have already said so eloquently, including those who have spoken so movingly here today. I think most of us have been staggered by the many things that he accomplished during his life. His public service kept him at the center of the events that have shaped our destiny. This week, Time magazine says that by sheer endurance, he rebuilt his standing as the most important figure of the post-war era. During his years of public service, Richard Nixon was on center stage during our generation. He had a great respect for the office of the president. I never heard him one time criticize a living president who was in the office at that time. There's an old Indian saying, "Never criticize a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes." However, there was another side to him that's more personal, more intimate, more human, that we've heard referred to several times today, and that was his family. his neighbors and his friends who are gathered here today. It was a side that many people did not see. For Richard Nixon was a private person in some ways, and then some people thought there was a shyness about him. Others sometimes found him hard to get to know. There were hundreds of little things he did for ordinary people that no one would have ever known about. He always had a compassion for people who were hurting. No one could ever understand Richard Nixon unless they understood the family from which he came, the Quaker church that he attended, Whittier College, where he studied, and the land and the people in this area where you're sitting today. His roots were deep in this part of California. But there's still another side to him that was his strong and growing faith in God. He never wore his religious faith on his sleeves, but was rather reticent to speak about it in public. He could have had more reasons than most for not attending church while he occupied the White House when there were so many demonstrations and threats going on. But he wanted to set an example, and he decided to have services most Sundays in the White House. A small congregation, a clergyman from various denominations. And I remember before one of the first services that President Nixon had at the White House, Ruth and I and two of our friends were in the private quarters with him. I'll never forget the president sitting down on the spur of the moment at an old battered Steinway that they had there, playing the old hymn, "He will hold me fast, for my Savior loves me so. He will hold me fast." John Donne said that there's a democracy about death. It comes equally to us all and makes us all equal when it comes. And I think today every one of us ought to be thinking about our own time to die, because we too are going to die, and we're going to have to face Almighty God with the life that we lived here. There comes a time when we have to realize that life is short, and in the end the only thing that really counts is not how others see us here, but how God sees us and what the record books of heaven have to say. For the believer who has been to the cross, death is no frightful leap into the dark, but is an entrance into a glorious new life. I believe that Richard Nixon right now is with Pat again, because I believe that in heaven we will know each other. The Bible says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." There's a gaining about death. For the believer, the brutal fact of death has been conquered by the resurrection and of Jesus Christ. For the person who has turned from sin and has received Christ as Lord and Savior, death is not the end. For the believer, there's hope beyond the grave. There's a future life. Yesterday, as his body was escorted to the plane for its final journey here, the band played, and the familiar strains of a hymn he especially loved, maybe the hymn that he loved the most, were played. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I've already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, for grace will take me home. That hymn was written 200 years ago by an Englishman named John Newton. He was a cruel man, a captain of a slave ship. But one night in a fierce storm, he turned to God and committed his life to Christ. Newton not only became a preacher of the gospel, but he influenced William Wilberforce and others in Parliament to bring an end to the slave trade. John Newton came to know the miracle of God's amazing grace, and it changed his life, and it changed our lives as well. And so we say farewell to Richard Nixon today with hope in our hearts, for our hope is in the eternal promises of Almighty God. Years ago, Winston Churchill planned his own funeral. And he did so with the hope of the resurrection and eternal life, which he firmly believed in. And he instructed after the benediction that a bugler positioned high in the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral would play taps, the universal signal that says the day is over. But then came a very dramatic moment, as Churchill had instructed. Another bugler was placed on the other side of the massive dome, and he played the notes of reveille, the universal signal that a new day has dawned, and it is time to arise. That was Churchill's testimony that at the end of history, the last note will not be taps, it'll be reveille. There is hope beyond the grave, because Jesus Christ has opened the door to heaven for us by his death and resurrection. Richard Nixon had that hope, and today that can be our hope as well. And to the children and the grandchildren, I would say to you, you have that hope within your hearts. I had the privilege of knowing them when they were little girls, and I've seen them as they've come to know Christ and to know God in their lives. And we look forward to seeing Dick and Pat someday in the future again. Shall we pray? God of all comfort, in the silence of this hour, we ask thee to sustain this family and these loved ones, and to deliver them from loneliness, despair, and doubt. Fill their desolate hearts with thy peace, and may this be a moment of rededication to thee. Our Father, those of us who have been left behind have the solemn responsibilities of life. Help us to live according to thy will and for thy glory, so that we will be prepared to meet thee. We offer our prayer in the name of him who is the resurrection and the life, Jesus Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
President Nixon and his family will now be escorted to the committal site by the celebrants, presidents, and first ladies. We ask that you remain and listen as Dr. Graham conducts the committal service. Please rise for the playing of the honors and the national anthem.
as a boy here at this place with Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. For as much as it hath pleased Almighty God in his wise providence to take out of this world the soul of our deceased father, grandfather, leader, and friend, we therefore commit his body to the ground.
Present.
Shall we pray the prayer that our Lord taught us to pray? Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen.
Firing party! Fire 3 volleys! Present.
Order.
April Day, the 37th President of the United States is laid to rest just a few feet from the house where 81 years ago he first came into the world. I'm Judy Woodruff here with my colleague Bruce Morton. Bruce, it has been a ceremony full of solemnity, full of respect for this man who's so dominated American political and international life for the past several decades.
Full of a great deal of emotion, too, from all sorts of people, not simply the family, but many of the friends. He was a complicated, complex, contradictory man, had fast friends and fervent enemies, and I guess maybe if you had to pick one line about him of all that was said today, it's Henry Kissinger's quote from Shakespeare, "We shall not look upon his like again."
And the one other memorable line, there were several today, was President Clinton saying, "Let this be the end of remembering Richard Nixon for anything other than the totality of his life." In so many words, he was saying, let's stop associating him with the Watergate scandal and nothing else.
Well, it's a good day to do that.
It certainly is. We want to say that the children who were standing there next to Julie Eisenhower and Patricia Cox, one of the ones whose face you saw there, just as the ceremony was just concluding a moment ago, was Alex Eisenhower, 12 years old. He and his sisters Melanie and Jenny were there with their parents, along with Christopher Cox, the other grandchild of Richard Nixon. This concludes our coverage this afternoon of this, and I want to say at this point that I made a mistake in some commentary earlier in the afternoon, and I want to point it out, and that was I said that Boris Yeltsin was the former president of Russia. Of course, he is very much the current and living and active president, and we apologize for those mistakes, for that mistake. The crowd is beginning to disperse. The rain has held off. It looks like it may rain any minute, but this was a day when the weather cooperated.
It held off when it needed to.
That's right. On behalf of Bruce Morton and my other many colleagues for CNN, I'm Judy Woodruff, Yorba Linda, California, concluding our coverage of the Richard Nixon funeral services.
Linda you're seeing now. Nixon was one of the most controversial figures in America while he was alive, and he will undoubtedly remain controversial in history. At Crossfire, we ordinarily thrive on controversy, but I think on this occasion it will be fairly subdued. John?
Walter Isaacson, you've written an autobiography, a biography of Henry Kissinger, and obviously in that process had to research the Nixon foreign policy a great deal. But in his eulogy tonight, Bob Dole listed some of the Nixon domestic initiatives, the ending of the draft, the environmental initiatives, starting EPA, the child nutrition programs, war on cancer, the innovative initiatives in healthcare and welfare reform. Won't the historians of the future recognize that perhaps Nixon trumped his own domestic achievements with his successes in foreign policy and have to give a little more focus and credit to the domestic agenda he had?
I think Nixon was a very complex man in everything he did, and there was a light side to him, there was a brilliant side to him, there was also the dark and brooding side. And I think sometimes when he had the advisors who appealed to his good side, Robert Finch and others who were responsible for some of the domestic initiatives you pointed out, he was able to do very great things. I think that the domestic agenda of Richard Nixon has been lost, overshadowed both by Watergate and by the foreign policy. Go ahead, sorry.
No. I think the point you make is very important on Finch. Well, I was just going to add that one of the domestic achievements he had was bringing a Finch in, bringing a Pat Moynihan in, and in essence, providing a much more liberal perspective to his domestic agenda than a lot of people might have realized.
Not just liberal. I think there was a very creative perspective to his domestic agenda. I think that got terribly overshadowed by Watergate. It got overshadowed by both the successes and the controversy and the failures of his foreign policy. I do think, though, that in the end, when, as President Clinton said, you look at the totality of the life, there was no coherent theme to his domestic policy in terms of a vision for what the role of government should be in our lives. And I think
I think it is true.
Let me introduce you first. This is Jim Gannon, who's written a biography of Gerald Ford and is also an expert on the period, obviously.
I think it is true that his domestic achievements were certainly overshadowed by his foreign policy achievements, and rightly so. I think they were far more significant. I thought that the service was quite interesting today, particularly that Kissinger should have quoted Shakespeare as in that splendid line. And there is a Shakespearean dimension to Richard Nixon. His life was absolutely filled with drama. And there was about him human emotion and power throughout. There was some of Macbeth, some of Hamlet in him. There was Lear and Richard III. He was all of these people, and really one of the most extraordinary figures of this century.
Okay, Roger Stone joins us now from Yorba Linda, where he's been attending the funeral. Roger Stone was an aide to Nixon in the later years, more after he left office than during office, I believe. Is that right, Roger?
I couldn't pick that up, Mike. Say it again, please.
You were closer to Nixon in his later years after he left office.
That's absolutely true. I worked in the 68 and 72 campaigns, but I really came to know the man after he left the White House.
Do you agree with what John Sununu was suggesting earlier? I don't know if you could hear him, that essentially Richard Nixon should go down in history as a great liberal domestic policy president.
There's no question that Richard Nixon had a very progressive domestic policy in the area of environmental protection, the war on cancer, federal revenue sharing, the Philadelphia plan, the desegregation of the public schools. He was a very progressive president.
The Philadelphia plan, of course, was the origins of what is now called affirmative action and reverse discrimination, which a generation of Republicans have been running against. Isn't there a certain irony there?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Nixon's domestic policies were more moderate in the mainstream of his party. He'd been an early supporter of civil rights in the Senate in 1950. He had rejected in the late 60s an effort to put segregationist planks into the Republican platform in the South. So I think on balance, even though this all got overshadowed by his foreign policy accomplishments, he was in the progressive wing of his party.
Don't forget also, Roger, that he was he put through the House of Representatives the Family Assistance Plan, which could not be passed in the Senate. But this was an event far ahead of its time, and we're still trying to do it today.
Well, there's no question that he foresaw the health care struggle going on in Congress today, the welfare reform through his family assistance plan. Now, he was not successful in either of those efforts, but he put forward very far-reaching, very modern plans of overseeing by a decade that these would be burning problems for the American public.
Roger, from a more personal point of view, from a number of memorable situations I had with the president, didn't his awkwardness really mask a gentleman that was much more solicitous and much more sympathetic than his public appearance? And isn't there an irony there that those people who knew him actually remember that side of him as much as anything else?
Well, I think that it is safe to say that Nixon, in his final years, I forget who wrote it, but someone said much of the bile was gone. I think there's no question that he was trying in his final years to atone for the mistakes made in Watergate, mistakes he admitted in television interviews, mistakes that he wrote about. I think the way he conducted the office of ex-president, taking no corporate fees, sitting on no corporate boards, taking no honorariums for speeches, not doing any of the international business deals that could have reaped him millions of dollars. He was very cognizant of how to conduct the office of ex-president, and I think he did so with dignity. He also broke his rules at the end because he did not offer his successors as president his advice unless it was solicited until Bill Clinton. He reached out to Clinton numerous times early in the Clinton administration because he felt that the Russian issue was so burning, was so vital, that he had to impart his advice to Clinton.
All right, hold on a second, Roger. We have to take a break. We'll continue the special edition of Crossfire in just a moment.
Welcome back to this special edition of Crossfire. Jim Cannon, Middle America was much more sympathetic to Richard Nixon than either the Beltway pundits or the liberals in the academic world. Was that a coincidence of philosophy and issues, or were they a little bit more forgiving about the awkwardness and the toughness of character?
First, I think that we always like our presidents in the country better than we like them in Washington. This was so of Truman, Eisenhower, all of them, just about. So they're more popular with the people than they are with the particularly with the press in Washington, or certainly within the Beltway. But I think there was recognition throughout the country that of Nixon's seriousness of purpose and his intentions. I think it should be emphasized also that Nixon's record of accomplishment took place almost entirely in his first term. By the time he was inaugurated for the second term, Watergate was already a great troubling thing. And by February of 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee had already been passed, and by March, John Dean and others were talking to the special prosecutors about what Nixon had done. So I think that we have a special reason to pay tribute for Nixon, because what he did accomplish, he did in almost entirely in this first term.
Walter Isaacson, I was sort of surprised to hear Henry Kissinger in his eulogy this evening talk about Richard Nixon as being the originator of the American human rights policy, which later became so predominant in the late 70s and the 80s, because I had thought that what the strong case for Richard Nixon as a foreign policy theorist was that he was the great realist under the tutelage of Henry Kissinger, putting America's interests first and not worrying too much about things like human rights. Have I got it wrong?
No, I think that's right. Like many presidents, he was able to take a realist outlook and use some Wilsonian rhetoric about democracy, rhetoric about American values in the world. But more than most any other president, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt, Nixon was a pure realist, one who believed in power, one who did not believe that human rights or other sentiments should get into the way of what were America's national interests. I think that what Kissinger was referring to was the Helsinki Accords, which finally had a human rights basket to it, which had a great impact on the world. I think it was disingenuously generous of Henry Kissinger to give Richard Nixon credit for that part of the Helsinki Accords.
Well, Walter, what was Henry Kissinger's relationship with Richard Nixon?
Oh, it was the oddest couple type of relationship you could ever imagine. I think they reinforced to some extent the dark side of one another. They were both relatively secretive, conspiratorial. There was a line that Senator Dole used today, I guess as a compliment, in which he quoted Nixon as saying, "I got up every morning to confound my enemies." Nixon very much believed in a world of enemies, and it was a useful view to have in the midst of the Cold War, because America did have some real enemies.
Walter, we've got to stop for a break.
Sure.
We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to Crossfire. Roger Stone, one of Richard Nixon's most amazing attributes was the almost encyclopedic knowledge he had of GOP politics and national politics, district by district. And he often knew more about a congressman's political structure than the given congressman. He really did keep up with that almost to the last days, didn't he?
There's no question. I spoke to him 3 times on the phone in the week before he died. One of those conversations was about the Whitewater affair, where he analyzed it not from a partisan point of view, but from a purely analytical point of view. Secondly, we talked a little about the '96 presidential race that he was already handicapping. And thirdly, he told me he was ready to leave for Russia again. He was packing his bags to go meet with Gorbachev. So he was very much on top of his game.
Roger, didn't almost every one of the political contenders or almost contenders try and make sure that they spent some time talking to him before they threw their hat in the ring?
Well, Nixon worked the phones relentlessly. He was constantly talking to county chairmen and state chairmen and old political friends and congressmen and senators, and therefore you wanted to get good chatter out of Richard Nixon. The way to do that was to go see him and ask for his advice. So most of the would-be '96 aspirants had made their way to New Jersey or had seen him when he was in Washington.
Roger Stone, this is too tantalizing to pass up. What was Richard Nixon's analysis of the Whitewater affair?
Well, I pointed out to him that the polls showed that there was very little damage to President Clinton's popularity, and he pointed out to me that he had not suffered from the Watergate affair until the televised hearings, and then the polls took a real dip. What he told me was the American people don't believe anything until they see it on television, and when they see televised Whitewater hearings, it'll be Clinton's turn in the bucket.
Okay, Walter Isaacson, Nixon's greatest diplomatic triumph is widely held to be the détente with the Soviet Union. How will history record détente, do you think? given the fall of the Soviet Union, which no one really predicted at the time, which happened so soon afterwards?
I think you have to put détente with the Soviet Union into the context of the opening to China, because what it really was a triangular balance. Nixon was, as I said, had a fine feel for enemies. He knew how to play China off against the Soviet Union. He knew how to stand up to the Soviets, yet also offer arms control and the other elements of trade that became what was known as détente. I think in the end, that did pave the groundwork for the collapse of the Soviet Empire. I get some of the credit. The credit goes to a lot of other people, including all the way from Truman to President Reagan. But I think that détente, balance with an opening to China, was an important part of a foreign policy that led to the end of the Soviet Empire.
Jim Cannon, you did an autobiography on President Ford. What was the President Ford's relationship with President Nixon, particularly in that period of time when he was his vice president?
Well, for 25 years they had been close friends, and that close friendship was one main reason that Nixon picked Ford. I know also there were other factors. The Democratic leaders of Congress virtually imposed the choice of Ford on Nixon. But to answer your question, it was a very guarded relationship. Ford became vice president, believing implicitly that Nixon had no involvement in Watergate or the cover-up. Over time, his views changed, and he made a conscious decision to go out into the country, to go out as often as he could, to as many places as he could, for two reasons. One, so that he would not be involved in Watergate, and two, so that if it should happen that Nixon should leave office, then the country will at least have some idea of who he was.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all our guests. John and I will be back for a few seconds in just a couple of moments.
Sure. Sorry about that. On behalf of all four former presidents who are here, President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, and on behalf of a grateful nation, we bid farewell to Richard Milhous Nixon.
John, you know, Herb Block, the political cartoonist, used to portray Nixon with a very heavy beard, but on his inauguration day, he famously gave him a free shave. And I think in the same spirit, on today of all days, I just won't say anything about Richard Nixon.
Michael, I think Richard Nixon was a president that made a big difference, a good difference. I think he always did better with Middle America than he did with the Beltway. I think he's going to do much better with the historians of the next generation than he did with some of the contemporary analysts. And the surprising thing to a lot of people, I think, is that his domestic initiatives will make a big part of the extra credit.
My lips are sealed. From the left, I'm Mike Kinsley. Good night for Crossfire.
From the right, I'm John Sununu. Join us again tomorrow night for another edition of Crossfire.
Larry King Live is next, and here's Larry himself with a little preview.
In the 340 at Newmarket. And one non-runner already today for Loxley. That's the second favourite. Now, Heather.
I'm the other one.
Yeah. Let's take a look at today's papers. And the Daily Mail leads on a full-page picture. The long wait for freedom as South Africans queue to vote, but it's the Sun that set today's political agenda with suggestions that John Major is to stir up the European debate as the only way to win the next election.
The Times leads on an opinion poll that says 75% of voters are unhappy with the Prime Minister.
Today goes for the story from Style Woman's Prison, where an inmate was forced to give birth in handcuffs.
The Mirror says it with a picture. My agony at the hands of the warders, it says, with an exclusive tag.
The Express leads on the golfer faced with a legal bill of £250,000 after losing a libel suit over allegations that he cheated.
And the Express has the authoritative guide to do-it-yourself funerals. Many enthusiasts, it warns, have watched as shelves collapse, but it's not funny when a coffin falls apart at a funeral. But it isn't really, is it?
No. Time now for the weather in Francis.
Well, looking outside, it doesn't look like it could be the warmest day of the year so far today over London, does it? It's overcast, but not the time to be losing nerve now. I still think it'll break and go blue and sunny and hot this afternoon. The black and white satellite picture is reflected sunlight. The sun's up enough now to see this. You see Spain and France and the snow on the Pyrenees. You see a lot of cloud over Britain, so you can't see Britain. Just now, out of all that cloud, it's raining over parts of Ireland and Scotland in here. But the sun's beginning to show signs of peeking through, particularly over East Anglia. It's a bit grim around the south coast and the west coast here because there's a low cloud under the high cloud that's everywhere. And this low cloud is giving the odd spot in the wind, and it's a manky morning. But this afternoon, I'm hoping and thinking it'll be the warmest day of the year so far, with the rain over Ireland and Scotland.
Well, that's it from us. ABC Nightline is next. See you
We'll be
tomorrow
back
morning.
tomorrow morning.
I'm going to campaign up and down in America until we drive the crooks and the communists and those that defend them out of Washington.
No one's words can capture the complexity of Richard Nixon better than those of the man himself.
We will be patient in working for peace. We will be conciliatory at the conference table, but we will not be humiliated.
There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you never concede anything.
The greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes.
Tonight, Richard Milhous Nixon, in his own words.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Every generation has a defining experience. It can be a war like Korea or Vietnam. It can be an event like Selma or Woodstock. It can last as long as the Great Depression or be over in a flash of gunfire, like the assassinations of Jack Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. or Bobby Kennedy. But to almost every American alive today, Richard Nixon has been an integral part of the fabric of our lives. Less so, perhaps, to the very young among us. Hard for them to understand the resentment of those who will never forgive him for Watergate. Equally hard for them to relate to the resonance he evoked among the silent majority. But Richard Nixon was not easily ignored, and on this day that he was buried, we thought we would evoke some memories among you older viewers and try to explain what all the fuss was about for some of the younger viewers among you. No commentary tonight, no analysis, just Richard Nixon talking about things that were important to him, like staying on the Republican ticket with Dwight Eisenhower in 1952.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency and as a man whose honesty and integrity has been questioned. And so now what I am going to do, and incidentally, this is unprecedented in the history of American politics. I am going at this time give to this television and radio audience a complete financial history. Everything I've earned, everything I've spent, everything I owe. And I want you to know the fact. I'll have to start early. I was born in 1913. Our family was one of modest circumstances, and most of my early life was spent in a store out in East Whittier. It was a grocery store, one of those family enterprises. The only reason we were able to make it go was because my mother and dad had 5 boys, and we all worked in the store. I worked my way through college and to a great extent through law school. And then in 1940, probably the best thing that ever happened to me happened. I married Pat, who's sitting over here. I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our 2 youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. And now, finally, I know that you wonder whether or not I am going to stay on the Republican ticket or resign. Let me say this. I don't believe that I ought to quit, because I'm not a quitter. Regardless of what happens, I'm going to continue this fight. I'm going to campaign up and down in America until we drive the crooks and the communists and those that defend them out of Washington. I can only say that if this competition, which you have just described so effectively, in which you plan to outstrip us, and particularly in the production of consumer goods, if this competition is to do the best for both of our peoples and for people everywhere, there must be a free exchange of ideas. There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the development of the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you. But in order for both of us to benefit, you see, you never concede anything. Wait till you see the picture.
Что моя речь тоже будет записана на английском языке.
Telecast over TV.
Будет, нет?
Certainly it will. Certainly. Yes. Right, right. In fact, and by the same token, everything that I say will be recorded and translated and will be carried all over the Soviet Union. That's a fair bargain.
The things that Senator Kennedy has said, many of us can agree with. There is no question but that we cannot discuss our internal affairs in the United States without recognizing that they have a tremendous bearing on our international position. There is no question but that this nation cannot stand still, because we are in a deadly competition. A competition not only with the men in the Kremlin, but the men in Peking. We're ahead in this competition, as Senator Kennedy, I think, has implied. But when you're in a race, the only way to stay ahead is to move ahead.
But as I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference, and I hope that what I have said today will at least make television, radio, the press, first, recognize the great responsibility they have to report all the news. And second, recognize that they have a right and a responsibility. If they're against a candidate, give him the shaft. But also recognize if they give him the shaft, put one lonely reporter on the campaign who will report what the candidate says now and then. Thank you, gentlemen, and good day.
When we come back, Richard Nixon sinks into the quagmire of Vietnam.
This is ABC News Nightline.
The Zulu chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi has withdrawn his threat to boycott South Africa's election after a promise to print extra ballot papers. 2 men have been shot dead in separate incidents in Belfast. Loyalist gunmen say they killed 1 man. No one's admitted the second shooting. And mourners at the funeral of the former American leader, Richard Nixon, have been asked to remember him as a flawed American hero, not a political villain.
Tonight on Sky at 8, over to Rebecca De Mornay. She begins a plan of revenge in the terrifying thriller The Hand That Rocks the Cradle on the movie channel Drama.
But I will not lie to the
public.
Joanne Woodward is the politician beset by scandal and tragedy in the Thursday night premiere, Blind Spot. At 10, action with Steven Seagal. Our season continues as he takes on a gang of drug dealers who've just moved into Chicago. He is marked for death. Over on the movie channel, Thursday Night Horror, the forces of evil are gathering around their new leader, a little girl called Delia, omen for The Awakening. Late on Sky Movies, battle begins between Wesley Snipes and Ice-T on the streets of New Jack City.
We gonna come off like the mob.
Late on the movie channel, comedy, as Golden Girl Rue McClanahan gets ready for the big day.
Who's gonna make the wedding?
She is the mother of the bride. And over on Gold, we ask the big question, Barbara Streisand. Is she or isn't she nuts? Find out at 10:05. Tonight on Sky.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun. That will be the great objective of this administration at the outset, to bring the American people together. This will be an open administration, open to new ideas, open to men and women of both parties, open to the critics as well as those who support us. We want to bridge the generation gap. We want to bridge the gap between the races. We want to bring America together. And I am confident that this task is one that we can undertake and one in which we will be successful.
We seek an open world, open to ideas, open to the exchange of goods and people, a world in which no people, great or small, will live in angry isolation. We cannot expect to make everyone our friend, but we can try to make no one our enemy.
To you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia. The areas in which these attacks will be launched are completely occupied and controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw. We take this action not for the purpose of expanding the war into Cambodia, but for the purpose of ending the war in Vietnam and winning the just peace we all desire.
In the light of the Kent State University incident, could you tell us what, in your judgment, is the proper action and conduct for a police force or a National Guard force when ordered to clear the campus area and faced with a crowd throwing rocks?
I do know that when you do have a situation of a crowd throwing rocks and the National Guard is called in, that there is always the chance that it will escalate into the kind of a tragedy that happened at Kent State. And if there's one thing I am personally committed to, it's this. I saw the pictures of those 4 youngsters in the Evening Star the day after that tragedy. And I vowed then that we were going to find methods that would be more effective to deal with these problems of violence.
Will you see any of the demonstrators tomorrow in the White House? Will you talk with them?
If arrangements are made by my staff so that they can come in to see me, I'll be glad to. I talk to great numbers of people. I will be there all day long. As a matter of fact, I'll be there tonight, tomorrow, as well. But sometimes it is quite difficult to
arrange which group should come in. I know members of my staff will go out to see them. I've asked all the younger members of my staff to talk to the demonstrators and try to get their views, as we did on November 15th and October 15th, and I'll be glad to see them if some of them are available.
When we come back, Watergate.
She could have made it easier, a simple rose or freezier, not something fit to make a chap boss-eyed. Thank goodness for the polycell. It always does the job so well, matching patterns with some slip and slide. Now alcoves hold no fear for me. The paper slips round easily, not sticking fast before you've made it through. This polycell is clever. It could hold it up forever. But I bet next year the missus wants it blue.
Polycell, making it easier to be perfect.
New from Nivea Visage, Energizing Vitality Cream. Our unique Nanosphere complex carries active ingredients which enhance your skin's look of natural vitality. From Nivea Visage, Energizing Vitality Cream. Naturally beautiful face care.
When you get acid indigestion or heartburn, Rennie works fast. In fact, more people in Britain take Rennie than any other indigestion remedy. Fast, effective Rennie for on-the-spot relief.
Who's setting me up, Peter? UK Gold. Prime time, all the time.
It was a real challenge. Develop a new towel for Kotex that fits better to protect better. But how? Make it curved. Women are. The first towel to be soft and gently gathered, designed to fit the body for real protection. Kotex curved towels, in super and now new normal. Confidently Kotex.
Now's a great time to do that DIY job. I'm doing the hall now because Do It All are doing interest-free credit.
He's doing the patio now because Do It All are doing interest-free credit.
Spend over £200 on absolutely anything at Do It All and get 6 months interest-free credit. No deposit, free local delivery, so do it now. I'm doing it now because I'm expecting a long, hot summer. Do It All, better product and guaranteed unbeatable prices with interest-free credit on everything.
Monday at 9, a Sky One exclusive.
I'm convinced God placed me here to kill all whores.
Find out who Jack the Ripper really was.
He was cunning and merciless. I need to repeat my pleasure as soon as possible.
Startling new evidence.
If the diary's true, then this solves a 105-year-old murder.
The Diary of Jack the Ripper, revealed for the first time.
I cannot believe I have not been caught.
Michael Winner presents The Diary of Jack the Ripper, Monday at 9, exclusive to Sky One.
In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair. These include charges of illegal activity during and preceding the 1972 presidential election, and charges that responsible officials participated in efforts to cover up that illegal activity. The inevitable result of these charges has been to raise serious questions about the integrity of the White House itself. Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of two of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know. I want to stress that in accepting these resignations, I mean to leave no implication, whatever, of personal wrongdoing on their part. I will not place the blame on subordinates, on people whose zeal exceeded their judgment, and who may have done wrong in a cause they deeply believe to be right. In any organization, the man at the top must bear the responsibility. That responsibility, therefore, belongs here, in this office. I accept it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dan Rather with CBS News. President,
Are you running for something?
No, sir, Mr. President, are you?
I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office. We think sometimes when things happen that don't go the right way, we think that when you don't pass the bar exam the first time, I happened to, but I was just lucky. I mean, my writing was so poor, the bar examiner said, we just got to let the guy through. We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as T.R. said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you. Those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
A little more than 2 years ago, Mr. Nixon made what would be his last appearance on Nightline.
It would be easy for me to do like many other former officials, to spend my time relaxing, playing golf, playing bridge, and that sort of thing. But as far as I'm concerned, when I have so little time left, I want to use every minute of it sharing my views to the extent that they are useful with others. Whether they disagree with them or not, I think it's important now that we hear all the views we can possibly get so that we make the right decision.
And he is still dispensing those views to this very day. Tomorrow, his 10th book, Beyond Peace, will start coming off the presses. And through it, Richard Nixon will continue to exercise influence. We cannot, he writes, react to every emergency call like an international 911 operator, but we must respond to those that affect our vital interests in the world. The debacle in Somalia was a lesson in how not to conduct U.S. foreign policy. What began as a highly popular humanitarian relief program under President Bush became a highly controversial UN nation-building project under President Clinton. As the world's richest nation, we should always be generous in providing humanitarian aid to other nations, but we should not commit U.S. military forces to UN nation-building projects unless our vital interests are involved, a test that neither Somalia nor Haiti satisfied. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.